The Arizona dark holds its breath. A woman stands on a ridge above a burning ranch, rifle raised, smoke threading up from the valley floor where men with hired guns have come to take what was never theirs. She does not flinch. She does not call for help. She has been waiting for this night for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Since the morning her husband rode out before the sun and did not come back. Below, boots cross her land. Torches move through her barn. She knows every inch of this ground, every shadow, every stone. They came for the copper buried beneath her south pasture. They came thinking a widow would fold. The Sharp's rifle settles against her shoulder. They were wrong. The desert does not forgive. That was the first thing Nora Calloway's father told her when she was old enough to sit a horse alone, when the Arizona sun had already burned the back of her neck to the color of old copper, and the saguaro stood around them, like silent witnesses to everything the land had seen and kept. The desert does not forgive. It only remembers. And she had spent 44 years learning exactly what he meant by that. Learning it in the way you learn the things that matter, not from books or sermons but from the ground itself, from the way it gave and took, from the way it held the shapes of boots and hooves and wagon wheels, long after the people who made those marks had turned to dust and memory. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days since James Calloway went out on a November morning with his rifle and his good hat, and did not come back. She still counted. She had stopped telling people she counted. But she still did it, the way you press a bruise to remind yourself it is real. To remind yourself the pain is not something you invented in the dark hours before dawn, when the ranch house made its settling sounds, and every creak in the floorboards was something that could have been him coming in from a late check on the horses. The bedroom faced east. She had always been grateful for that. Grateful because the first light cme in hard and certain and gave her something to look at before she had to decide how to arrange her face for the day ahead. This particular morning, the light came in the color of a new penny, which meant heat, which meant the horses would need extra water before noon, and the eastern fence line would be shimmering by mid-morning, and Reed would already be out there, her son with his father's shoulders and her father's stubbornness, working without being asked because that was the only way he knew how to move through grief, quietly, forward, his hands always occupied. She dressed in the dark out of habit. Calico dress the color of dried clay, the one with the mended collar she kept meaning to replace. Leather vest over it, soft from years of wear, the pocket on the left side where she kept the small folding knife her father had given her, the summer she turned 16, tall boots already broken in at the ankle. Wide-brim felt hat on the peg by the door. Apache knife at her belt, the one with the bone handle carved smooth by her grandfather's hands before hers. She did not think about these things. She put them on the way she breathed. Outside, the air still held the night's coolness. Still held it the way the desert only holds things briefly, knowing it will burn them away by 9. Painted Canyon Ranch spread out before her in the gray blue of early morning. 1,800 acres of Arizona territory that her great-grandfather had worked out of raw land with a crew of 4 men and a determination that the family history described only as considerable. The house behind her was adobe and timber, 2 stories. The second story added the year she and James married, when they were both young enough to believe that bigger meant better and more rooms meant more future. The barn was to the south, weathered to a silver gray, that she had always thought was beautiful, in a way the new red-painted barns in the catalogs could never be. The horse paddock beyond it, the tool shed, the long fence line that stretched south and east and west until the land ran out of what was theirs and became what was not. She walked to the barn first, the way she always did. The horses knew her step. Thunder, the quarter-horse stallion with the white sock on his left foreleg, turned his big head before she opened the stall door and made the low sound that was not quite a greeting and not quite a question but something in between. Midnight, the dark mare was already awake and watching. And the others down the line, each one turning, each one acknowledging her the way animals acknowledge people they trust, which is quietly and without drama and with the kind of absolute certainty that humans rarely manage. She checked their water, checked their feed, ran her hand along Thunder's neck and felt the warmth there, the solid aliveness of him, and stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a barn before full daylight, which is one of the few kinds of quiet that actually deserves the name. Then she heard it, not the sound itself exactly, more the absence of what should have been there. The way Midnight's ears went up and forward. The way thunder shifted his weight. Animals hear trouble before it makes a sound, and she had learned to read them the way her father taught her to read the sky, the way her grandfather had taught her father, back through the generations until you got to people who had no choice but to read the world correctly or not survive it. She was back out of the barn in 4 steps. The south paddock gate was open. Open was not the word. Exactly. It had been broken. The wood of the latch post was splintered in a way that said force rather than accident, said hands rather than wind, said intent rather than chance. And beyond the gate, in the pale morning light, 2 shapes moving. 2 riders. 2 horses that were not their horses being ridden by people who were moving with the particular urgency of people who believed they were not being watched. Midnight Storm. The dark stallion worth more than most men made in 3 years. Moving between them at a pace that said he was being led, not following willingly. She did not shout. She did not run back for help. She went to Thunder's stall, had the bridle on in 30 seconds because she had done it 10,000 times and her hands knew the buckles in the dark, and she was up and moving before the thought of caution had time to form itself into a full objection. The riders were pushing south toward Devil's Notch, the narrow ravine that cut through the red rock formations at the edge of the property and opened onto the old wagon road beyond. She knew that road. She knew every road out here. She knew the land the way she knew her own hands, the way she knew the sound of her son's voice when he was lying about something, and the sound when he was not. And she knew a better way to Devil's Notch than the one they were taking. She turned Thunder hard right, up the game trail that climbed the eastern face of the ridge. It was not a trail most people would use. Steep enough that a horse had to want it. Narrow enough that the rocks brushed your boots on both sides. But Thunder wanted it because Thunder trusted her, which was the entirety of what she needed from him. At the top of the ridge, the light broke wide open. That first full moment of Arizona sunrise that was almost violent in its beauty. Gold and amber spreading across the canyon like something being poured. She could see them below, still threading through the narrow section of the ravine, unaware of her. She could see where the ravine bent around the far rock face and opened into the wider stretch before Devil's Notch proper. She was already moving down the far side of the ridge before they reached the bend. When they came around it, she was there. Thunder stood sideways across the trail. The Winchester rested across the saddle in front of her. Easy, the way you hold something you are accustomed to holding. The morning light was behind her, which was not an accident. She had positioned herself so the sun came from over her right shoulder and fell directly into their eyes. The larger of the 2 men pulled up hard. His horse skittered sideways. He was broad through the chest, bearded, wearing a canvas color of old dust. A scar cut through his right eyebrow, white against the weathered skin, old enough to be a story he had stopped telling. The second man was younger, thinner, with a flat crown hat, pulled low and eyes that went immediately to the rifle before they went to her face. That's far enough. Her voice was level, not loud. Loud was for people who needed to prove something. That horse belongs to this ranch. The bearded man spat to one side. Get out of the road, woman. We don't want trouble. You broke my paddock gate before sunrise. You already found it. A moment. The kind of moment where everything is still deciding what it will be. Then her right hand moved, not toward the rifle, to the coiled rope at her saddle horn, which was already loose. Already ready, because she had loosened it on the way up the ridge when her hands needed something to do, while her mind was working out angles and distances. The loop left her hand in a single clean arc and dropped over the larger man's shoulders before he registered what she had thrown. She pulled. He came off his horse sideways and hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from him. She had him tied with the leather cord from her vest pocket before he got the breath back, wrists behind him, not tight enough to hold a calf. The younger man's hand went to his hip, to the gun there. Her other hand had already found the bone-handled knife. Not the Winchester. The knife, because the Winchester made a large statement and this needed a precise one. It covered the distance between her hand and the back of his gun hand in less than a second, the blade turning flat, the weight of it finding his knuckles in a way that made him yell and made him let go. The knife had not cut him. It had only convinced him. There was a difference, and she was exact about such differences. Next one, she said, I'm less careful about where it lands. He got down from his horse slowly. His hand was shaking. He got down and he stood there and he did not do anything else. It took her 4 minutes to have them both secured with durable leather cord on the ground, sitting up, back to back, tied to the same mesquite post at the side of the trail. Midnight Storm stood nearby, calm now, having decided the situation was resolved. The horse had better judgment than the men who had tried to take him. She retrieved her knife from the dirt, wiped it on the side of her boot. Then she crouched down in front of the bearded man to check the knot, and that was when she saw it. The left side of his neck, just above the collar of his duster. A tattoo, not large, not elaborate. A lion in profile facing right with a small crown above its head. Simple lines like something made from a template rather than imagination, like a mark that was meant to be recognized by the people who needed to recognize it, rather than admired by anyone else. She knew that mark. Every rancher within 50 miles of the Arizona territorial border knew that mark, or should have. It appeared in conversations that dropped low when they got to the relevant part. It appeared in warnings that passed between people who moved livestock or owned land near the rough southern stretches of the territory. It was the mark of Tate Boone's outfit, sometimes called the Panhandle Crew, sometimes called other things depending on who was doing the calling, working out of the Texas Panhandle and ranging wherever the work took them. Work that ranged from cattle theft to things that cattle theft was used to cover for. These were not ordinary horse thieves. She stood up, looked out over the canyon. The morning light was doing what Arizona morning light did, making the landscape look permanent and indifferent and larger than any human problem. She was not afraid. She noticed that about herself. Not afraid, but something else. Something that felt like the closing of a door she had been leaving slightly open for 2 years. Something that felt like confirmation. She left them there and went back to find Reed. Her son was already moving when she came over the South Rise, already on horseback, riding toward the sound that had not quite been a sound, toward the instinct that had woken him. He was 22 years old and he had his father's particular way of sitting a horse, upright and easy at the same time, as if the horse was an extension of his own intentions rather than a separate creature he was managing. Flannel shirt the color of sage, canvas trousers, leather suspenders, boots worn pale at the toe. The colt at his hip that James had given him on his 19th birthday, cleaned and kept with the same conscientiousness he brought to everything. When she told him what she had found at the paddock and what she had done about it, he listened without interrupting, the way James had listened, the full attention of someone who understood that the details were not decoration but load-bearing. The Boone outfit, not a question. The mark was clear. They came for midnight specifically. They came for midnight specifically. She paused. Or they came to see what would happen when they tried. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way young people look at their parents when they are reassessing something they thought they had already figured out. You think it was a test. I think men like that don't show their hand first. I think they show something that looks like their hand while they decide what to do with the real one. Marshal Clem Porter arrived 2 hours later on a roan that was going gray at the muzzle, the badge on his wool coat catching the morning light. He was 52 years old and had been marshal of this stretch of Arizona territory for 11 years, long enough that the job had become a kind of whether he existed inside rather than something he actively performed. He had the square, deliberate face of a man who had decided long ago that composure was worth more than quickness, and he wore it the way he wore everything, without much adjustment for circumstances. He took the 2 men into custody with a minimum of conversation, asked Nora a few questions that were practical rather than investigative, looked at the broken paddock gate without comment. When he turned to leave, she noticed that he looked at the tattooed mark on the large man's neck for slightly longer than he needed to, and that he did not write anything down when he did. She noticed. She said nothing about noticing. Old Solomon Gray arrived before noon, which was not unusual. Solomon had a way of appearing when things happened on this ranch that suggested either very good instincts or very good information, and Nora had never been inclined to ask which because she trusted both. He was 73 years old, Apache by blood and by everything else that mattered, and he moved through the world with the particular authority of someone who had long ago stopped needing the world's permission for anything. His wool coat had been the color of brown once, a long time ago. His moccasin boots were worn thin at the heel. His braid, silver white and long, was tied with a narrow piece of red cloth that Nora recognized as coming from a shirt she had given him 3 winters previous. He sat down on the bench outside the barn without being invited because he did not need invitations to this property, had not needed them since her father was alive, and perhaps before that. The Boone outfit, he said. She had not told him yet. How do you know? Word moves. He accepted the cup of coffee Reed brought out without looking up. From the middle distance he appeared to be reading like text. The Boone outfit does not ride north for horses. They ride north for land. This is not their land. Not yet. He looked at her then, dark eyes that had been looking at hard things for 7 decades, and had reached a kind of peace with the looking. Harlan Cutter has been buying mineral rights east of Tucson for 2 years. Every parcel between here and the Willows, every parcel but this one. The name settled in the air between them like smoke. Harlan Cutter. She had heard that name attached to various descriptions over the years, none of them flattering. All of them delivered in the tone people use when they are describing something they consider powerful enough to require that tone. 58 years old. Owner of First Territorial Bank in Tucson. Black wool suit in weather that called for something lighter, because the suit was not about comfort but about communication. Pocket watch on a gold chain. The kind of man who shook hands with both of his hands and looked you directly in the eye and said absolutely nothing of what he was actually thinking. He had sent her 3 letters in the past year. Formal letters on bank stationery, expressed in the careful language of business, offering to purchase Painted Canyon Ranch at prices that went up with each letter. She had used the first as kindling. She had sent the second back with a single line written on the back, in her own hand, not for sale. The third she had burned in the kitchen stove on a Tuesday morning while Reed watched and said nothing, and the fire accepted it without comment. He wants the land that badly, she said. He wants what's under it. Solomon set his coffee down. There are men who come through the reservation every few months, dressed like utility workers, asking questions about the ground. What kind of rock comes up when you dig? Where the water runs underground? What the old-timers say about what the earth holds in this part of the territory. He paused. They ask those questions the way men ask questions when they already know the answer, and need someone else to confirm it without realizing they're confirming anything. She thought about her grandfather, about walking with him along the south pasture fence when she was young enough that the fence posts seemed very tall, and him stopping sometimes and crouching down and pressing his palm flat against the ground, not saying anything, just listening in the way he listened to things, with his whole body rather than just his ears. She thought about James, about the way he had ridden the fence line twice a month without fail every month for 15 years, about the way he had started going out longer in the last year of his life, coming back later, quieter. She thought about the thing she had been not quite thinking for 2 years and felt it move closer to the surface. Cutter wants the mineral rights, she said. He's already sold them. Solomon looked at her steadily. Contingent on acquisition of the land. She stood up. The canyon stretched below her, red and enormous and ancient, and hers. Hers in the way that the word is insufficient for what she meant. Hers not as possession but as belonging. The land and her belonging to each other, in the way she had never been able to explain to anyone who had not grown up with their hands in the same dirt their grandparents had worked. James knew, she said. Not a question either, not quite. Solomon did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. That night she could not sleep, she did not fight it. She lay in the darkness of the east-facing bedroom for an hour, and then she got up and pulled on her boots and vest and hat and went downstairs, past the kitchen where the banked coals in the stove still gave off the smell of the pine she had added before bed, past the parlor with the 2 good chairs and the rug she and James had bought from the catalog the year Reed was born, past the framed photograph on the mantel of the 2 of them outside the barn in the summer of 1878, squinting against the sun, James with his hand raised to shade his eyes, her with her hat already pulled low, both of them younger than Reed was now. She stopped at the door to the office. She had not gone in since the January after James died. That January she had gone in once to find the deed documents and the bank papers, and the insurance certificate, the practical things, and she had done it quickly, and with her mind in the particular locked-down state she had developed for necessary tasks that were also unbearable, and then she had not gone back. The door opened on the same small squeak it had always had, the one James had meant to fix for 15 years and never quite got around to. The smell of the room was him, still, in the way smells last longer than you expect them to. leather and ink, and the particular dry paper smell of old records and the faint underlayer of the pipe tobacco he had given up the year before he died on the advice of a Tucson doctor, but that had never fully left the wood of the walls. His desk, his chair, the shelf of ranch records in their cardboard folders, the window that faced south, toward the pasture, and beyond that toward the darker mass of the hills that ran along the southern boundary of the property. His coffee cup was still on the desk. She had known it was there. She had known since January. She had not touched it because she was not ready to decide what touching it would mean, and also because in some irrational, persistent part of herself, she believed that leaving it there was a kind of fidelity to something she could not name, a refusal to complete the past tense of him. She sat down in his chair, felt the worn leather of it, the impression of his back in the way furniture takes on the shape of the person who uses it for decades. She sat very still and let the room be what it was for a minute, which was the most him-shaped space left in the world. Then she started going through the drawers. She was looking for anything. She did not know exactly what anything meant, which was the honest truth of it. She went through the ranch ledgers, and the fence repair records, and the old letters from suppliers, and the water rights documentation, and the property survey from 1869, and the livestock records going back 20 years. She read without reading, scanning for something that stood out, some difference in the handwriting or some entry that did not belong. In the bottom drawer, behind the insurance folder, her hand found a gap. She had not known it was there. Had not known because she had never had reason to press against the back of the drawer, to find where the wood did not quite sit flush, to notice that the seam between the bottom panel and the back panel of the drawer was slightly wider than it should have been. She pressed. The panel gave. Swung back on a simple hinge she could now see had been recently oiled, recently used, worked enough that it moved easily rather than sticking the way old wood sticks. The notebook was there. Small. Brown leather cover, the kind sold at the dry goods store in Tucson. Unremarkable. The kind of thing you would not notice if you saw it on a desk. She lifted it out. Opened it. James's handwriting. The particular upright, careful hand of a man who had been educated by a woman with a ruler and strong opinions about letter formation, and had never quite unlearned it. She knew this handwriting the way she knew his voice, knew it in the back of her throat. She read from the beginning. The first entries were ordinary. Ranch observations, fence conditions, water levels in the creek. The kind of notes a careful man makes when he is in the habit of writing things down. But around 8 months before his death, the character of the entries changed. They became shorter, more careful, written in a way that suggested he was aware of the possibility of someone else reading them, choosing words that meant something to him but would mean less to a stranger. Increased traffic, south boundary, night movement, third occurrence this month, and then a few weeks later, spoke with C. Porter. He says he'll look into it. Does not seem surprised enough by what I told him. This stays between myself and this page for now. And then 2 months before, found the fence. South boundary, third post from the Wilson property line. Cut and rejoined with wire. Professional work, not a rancher. Someone who does this regularly, who knows how to make it look intact from a distance. And then 6 weeks before, wagon tracks from the Wilson property side. Heavy loads. Night, twice weekly at minimum based on the ground. I know what heavy loads at night on a dirt road mean in this part of the territory, and I don't need a badge to recognize it. She turned the pages slowly. Her hands were very steady. She was aware of them being steady in a deliberate way, the way you are aware of your own breathing when you are trying to control it. The second to last entry, going to speak to Aldridge directly. Not Porter. If Porter is Cutters, and I am increasingly convinced he is, then Aldridge is the right channel. Federal over local. I'll ride to Tucson Friday. He had not ridden to Tucson Friday. The last entry. She read it 3 times. South fence again tonight. The Wilson mine property has light in it. I have always known that mine was played out 30 years ago. The light says otherwise. Someone is working that mine. Someone has been working it for a while. I need to understand what they are pulling out of it before I go to Aldridge. Need to be sure of what I'm telling him. Going out to look tomorrow morning. If I'm right about what's there, this land is worth more than any of us knew. And if Cutter knows that, it explains everything. The letters, the pressure, the night wagon traffic, all of it. I won't be long. I'll leave before the sun. He had left before the sun. He had not come back before it set. The official record said hunting accident. A shot from an unidentified firearm, the inquest said. Possibly someone's stray round from the hills. Possibly his own weapon discharged accidentally. The investigation was inconclusive. The inconclusive findings were filed, and the filing was complete, and the completeness of the filing was supposed to constitute resolution. She had never believed it. She had not let herself stop not believing it for 2 years, 3 months and 11 days. Because to stop not believing it was to accept that the people responsible for making it right were either incapable or complicit, and she was not ready for what that acceptance would require of her. She understood now, sitting in James's chair in James's office at 2 in the morning with his last words in her hands, ready. She did not cry. She had done her crying, had done it thoroughly and privately in the first weeks, the kind of grief that is also physical, that lives in the chest and the shoulders and the hollow behind the sternum. She had come through it the way you come through weather. She was through it. What she was sitting with now was something else, colder, cleaner, more purposeful. She read the entry one more time. Then she closed the notebook and held it in both hands, in her lap in the dark office that smelled of him, and she sat with the weight of what she now understood. James had found something. James had been going to act on it. James had been killed before he could. And the man who had been his contact when he first noticed the suspicious activity, the man he had trusted and then stopped trusting, the man whose name appeared in this notebook more than once, was Clem Porter, who had arrived this morning with his badge and his roan horse and his deliberate face, and had looked at the mark on the thief's neck for exactly 1 second too long. Outside, the desert night was doing what it did, holding its heat just barely against the cooling dark, the stars overhead extraordinary in the way they were only visible in places with no competing light, which was most of what Arizona Territory still was, thank God, vast and dark and indifferent and old. She pressed the notebook against her chest, just for a moment, as if the contact meant something. Then she stood up, and she went to the gun cabinet in the parlor, and she unlocked it, and she took out the Winchester and the Sharps rifle that had been James's before it was hers, and before that had been her father's, the big-bore long gun with the octagonal barrel and the walnut stock that was worn smooth at the grip from decades of hands. She set them both on the kitchen table. She went to the larder and took down the ammunition tins. She sat down at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the guns and the ammunition and the notebook that held her husband's last words, and she began to think about what came next. Not what she wanted. Not what was fair. What came next? Reed found her there at 4. He came downstairs without surprise, which told her he had heard her moving around and had chosen to give her the time. He looked at the table, looked at her, sat down across from her without being asked. She told him. All of it. The notebook, the entries, the Wilson mine, Porter's name, what she understood now about why the Boone outfit had shown up this morning, and what they were likely to show up for next. He listened the way he always listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the table, his father's hands. He knew, said simply, without accusation, without drama, just the weight of it. He knew, and he was trying to handle it carefully. He was trying to be sure before he went to the federal marshal, and Cutter found out he was about to. That's what the timing says. Reed looked at his hands, at the table, at some point in the middle distance that was actually the past, the hunting accident inquest. Porter was one of the witnesses. She had not known that. She felt it land with the small, sickening precision of a piece, fitting into a puzzle you had been hoping would not take that shape. I didn't know you knew about the inquest. I read everything I could find. A year ago. I didn't tell you because he stopped. Started again. I didn't know what to do with what I found, and I didn't want to give you a weight I couldn't help you carry. She looked at her son, at the 22-year-old man who had been deciding, apparently for a full year, what to bring her and what to carry alone. James would have done the same thing. The realization moved through her quietly. From now on, she said, we carry things together. He nodded. Once. The way his father had nodded. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift from black to the dark blue that preceded the first gray, and the birds that lived in the mesquite along the east fence were beginning the preliminary stages of their morning conversation. Another day arriving in Arizona Territory, the land already warm from the day before, holding its heat the way it held everything, long and close and without apology. She picked up the Winchester, checked it, set it down. She was not afraid of what was coming. She was not prepared to pretend she knew what was coming. But she was, for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, moving towards something rather than away from it. The notebook sat on the table between them like the foundation of a case that had not yet been built but now had its cornerstone. "First light," she said. "I'm going to look at the south fence line. I'm coming with you." "No," she looked at him steadily. "If I'm right about what's been happening down there, I don't want us both visible at the same time. You stay on the property. You keep your eyes on the approaches from the Tucson Road and the Wilson boundary. If anyone comes while I'm out, you don't open that door without the bar across it." He started to object. She could see it forming in the set of his jaw, the particular resistance of someone who does not want to be protected because they believe the person doing the protecting should not have to do it alone. Reed. Just the name. Just the way she said it. He exhaled, nodded. She stood up and refilled her coffee from the pot, and stood at the kitchen window watching the darkness lighten by degrees, watching her land come back into itself from the dark, the barn and the paddock and the long south fence that now meant something it had not meant yesterday morning, or rather meant something it had always meant, but that she had not known yet. James had pressed his palm against this ground and felt something in it, had ridden its boundaries faithfully for 15 years, and noticed when something changed. Had followed the thread of that change toward the truth of it, and had not lived to reach the end. She intended to reach the end. The first true light came in over the eastern ridge, gold and absolute, filling the canyon with the violent ordinary beauty of another Arizona morning. Painted Canyon Ranch held its ground under it, the way it had held its ground under every morning for 4 generations. Immovable, particular, blood-soaked in the best sense of that phrase. The sense that meant people had poured themselves into this land, and the land had kept them. She picked up the notebook, tucked it inside her vest, against her left side where she would feel it when she breathed. She pulled her hat down and went out into the light. She rode out before the heat settled in. 5 miles to the south fence, across terrain she could have crossed blind, across the dry wash that ran with water 3 weeks a year and lay cracked and pale the rest of it, across the stretch of creosote flat where the bushes grew in their spaced-out way that always looked deliberate, as if the land had made choices about where things should stand. Thunder moved at a working trot, ears forward, reading the ground. The morning air still carried its brief coolness. By the time she reached the first marker post, the sun was fully up and beginning to mean something. She did not go straight to the fence. She circled first, wide, the way her grandfather had taught her to approach anything you needed to look at, honestly. Come at it from the side, from the angle it does not expect. Let your eyes find what they find, rather than looking for what you already believe is there. She came at the south fence from the east, riding parallel to it at a distance of 200 yards, watching the ground between her and the fence line rather than the fence itself. The wagon tracks were there, plain as a road once you knew to look for them. Not fresh from last night, but not old either, maybe 3 days. The edges of the impression still sharp rather than crumbled. Heavy wagon, double axle, the kind used for freight rather than ranching. The kind of weight that said the load was substantial. The tracks ran parallel to the fence for 100 yards before angling south toward the fence line itself, toward a particular section of posts she had ridden past 100 times without stopping. She stopped now, dismounted, looped Thunder's reins over a mesquite branch, went to the fence on foot. The post was the third from the corner marker, just as James had written. From 10 yards away it looked like every other post on this fence, weathered gray wood, wire strung taut and even. From 3 yards she saw the wire was not the same color as the wire on either side of it. Slightly brighter, slightly newer, the kind of difference you would not register without looking for it. From 1 yard she could see where the cuts had been made and the wire rejoined with a splice that was good work, genuinely good work, done by someone who understood fencing well enough to make the repair look original rather than recent. She crouched down, looked at the ground on both sides of the fence at this point. On her side, on the ranch side, the soil was compacted in a way that said regular foot traffic, weight bearing down in the same place repeatedly. On the other side, which was technically open range before it reached the Wilson property line, the same. And in the loose dirt at the base of the post she found 2 things: a short length of wire coiled and left behind, the kind of detail a careful person might miss and a careless one definitely would, and a heel print. Boot, not moccasin. a working boot with a squared heel and a nail pattern at the toe that she memorized the way she memorized everything useful. She stood up and looked south. The Wilson property began a quarter-mile further on. The old mine on that property was visible from here. On a clear day, the dark rectangular cut of its entrance in the red rock face of the low hills. She could see it now, could see, if she looked carefully, something that she had not had reason to look carefully at before. Fresh marks in the earth below the mine entrance. Not cattle marks, not the random marks of weather. The regular, purposeful marks of equipment and foot traffic and work being done. James had been right. Someone was working that mine. And whatever they were moving from it came through the cut in her fence, across her land, and out the other side toward the Tucson road. Her land was a corridor. Her land was a route. And her husband had been killed for noticing it. She was back on Thunder and moving before the thought was fully formed, turning north, heading back toward the ranch at a pace that said something had changed. Because something had changed, not in what existed, that had existed for months or years, but in what she understood about it, and understanding is its own kind of event, its own kind of irreversible. She was 2 miles from the ranch house when she heard the second set of hooves, not behind her, to the west, matching her pace without intending to be noticed, which was the thing that made her notice. She did not change her speed, did not look directly west. Let her peripheral vision do the work while her face stayed forward, calm, unhurried. After another quarter mile she turned naturally, the way a rider turns to check the land, and she saw the horse and rider at the crest of the western rise. The rider was not Reed. The horse was Dark Bay, not one of theirs. The rider sat it with the straight-backed posture of someone trained rather than natural, shoulders squared, hands low, the particular controlled stillness of someone who was trying not to look like they were watching. She turned Thunder directly toward the rise. The rider paused for a moment, then came down the slope toward her rather than pulling back. A calculated decision. Come forward before you look like you were avoiding. She gave the man credit for the instinct even as she calculated what it meant. He was perhaps 48, lean in the way of men who covered distance regularly, wearing a federal wool coat, navy gone dusty at the shoulders, a badge that caught the morning light at his chest. The Winchester in his saddle scabbard was well used. His face had the quality of open terrain, flat and showing everything and nothing at the same time. Mrs. Calloway. He brought his horse to a stop 20 feet from her with the ease of long practice. I'm Frank Aldridge, U.S. Marshal, Tucson office. She looked at the badge, looked at his face. You were watching me ride the fence. I was watching the fence line. You happened to be riding it. How long have you been watching the fence line? Long enough to confirm what your husband reported to our office. He did not look away when he said it, did not soften it or dress it. Just put the words in the air between them and let them stay there. He wrote to us 4 months before he died, provided a detailed account of the wagon traffic, the fence modifications, the correlation with activity on the Wilson property. We opened a case. The ground seemed to shift slightly under Thunder's feet, though the horse had not moved. She was aware of the notebook inside her vest, pressed against her ribs. And you let him ride out there alone. We didn't know he was going out. We didn't know what was happening until after. Something moved in his face, brief and suppressed but real. I am sorry for that, Mrs. Calloway. I have been sorry for it for over 2 years. She looked at him for a long moment. The desert around them was doing its indifferent morning business, the light climbing, the heat building, the birds going about their bird concerns with complete disregard for the 2 humans sitting on horses, discussing murder and complicity and what comes next. Get down, she said. I'll make coffee. He got down. They sat at the kitchen table where she had sat at 4 in the morning with the guns and the ammunition, and Reed across from her with his father's hands flat on the wood. Reed was not in the kitchen now. He was on the roof of the barn with a clear view of both approach roads, which was where she had sent him before she rode out, because 2 years of grief had not made her careless, and if anything had sharpened her instinct for what needed covering. Aldridge drank his coffee without complaint about its strength, which was considerable. He laid out what the federal investigation had established over the past 2 years, with the particular precision of a man who kept things in order in his mind because disorder was a professional liability. The Boone outfit, he confirmed, was operating under contract, not running their own enterprise. providing muscle and logistics for someone with a larger plan and the money to fund it. The wagon traffic across her south fence had been confirmed on 4 separate occasions by federal observers, always at night, always involving cargo that was too heavy for livestock and too carefully handled for grain or dry goods. The Wilson mine had been surveyed 18 months ago by an outfit from back east using papers that named them as a geological assessment company, and that Aldridge had since determined were fraudulent. "The mine is producing," she said. "Not a question, copper. The deposit runs south and east under the Wilson property and extends under your south pasture. Based on what our geological contact has told us, the portion under your land is substantially the more valuable section of the whole." She held her coffee cup, felt the warmth of the ceramic against her palms. "What's it worth?" Aldridge's jaw shifted slightly. "Conservative estimate, based on current market prices and the extent of the deposit as surveyed. $40,000. The number sat in the kitchen the way large numbers do, occupying space, changing the dimensions of everything around it. "Cutter knows this," she said. "Cutter commissioned the survey. He knows it precisely. And he sold the mineral rights contingent on acquisition of the land before he had acquired it, which is the kind of confidence that requires either very good connections or a plan he considered essentially guaranteed." "Who did he sell the rights to?" Aldridge set his cup down. "Governor Wallace Pruitt is the primary investor in the syndicate that purchased them. Territorial governor, which is why the local legal apparatus has been less than fully functional in pursuing this matter." There it was. All of it at once, the full shape of the thing, the way a landscape looks when the fog burns off and you see not just the foreground but everything behind it all the way to the horizon. A banker with political connections and enough money to hire a Texas outfit and enough ambition to arrange what needed to be arranged. A territorial governor with a financial interest in the outcome and the power to slow any official process that might threaten it. A local marshal who had been compromised and had stayed compromised, because the alternative required a kind of courage he had not managed to find. And James, who had found it all by riding his own fence line faithfully for 15 years, had paid for the finding with his life. "You need to leave the ranch," Aldridge said. "You and your son, while we pursue this through federal channels." "No," said flatly. "Not with heat, not with drama. The way you say something you have already decided. Mrs. Calloway, these are men who have already committed murder, who have the resources to do it again and the connections to make it inconvenient for anyone who tries to make them answer for it. You staying here puts yourself and your son in direct danger. Leaving here puts my land in direct danger." She looked at him across the table. "And my land is not less important to me than my safety. My family has worked this ground for 4 generations. My husband is buried on that ridge. His father and mother are buried on the east slope. If I leave, Cutter will find a way to make sure I can't come back. I know men like Cutter. Giving ground to them is not a temporary retreat. It's a permanent decision." Aldridge studied her face for a moment with the expression of a man who is reassessing something he came in with a settled opinion about. "At minimum, accept additional presence. I have 2 deputies I can position on your property under agricultural worker cover." She considered this. "They know how to work a ranch?" "Passably. Put them on the east fence line. Real work. If they're not doing real work, they'll look wrong to anyone who knows ranching. And the Boone outfit will have someone watching this property before they move again." She stood up and took his cup before he finished with it, which was the signal that the conversation was moving forward whether he was ready or not. "And I want to be told what you find before you decide what to do with it. Not after." He looked like he wanted to argue. He did not argue. "Agreed." He left before noon, heading back toward Tucson on the dark bay, and she stood on the porch and watched him go and thought about the geometry of trust, about how little of it she had to work with, and how carefully she would need to place what there was. Solomon came that evening, without being asked, which was how Solomon came to things. He brought his great-nephew Dawes with him. 28 years old, broad through the shoulders with a tracking knife at his belt, and the particular quiet of someone who had learned to move through the world, making as little impression on it as possible, which was a skill that looked like shyness until you understood what it actually was. They unsaddled their horses at the barn and came to the kitchen, and Solomon accepted coffee, and Dawes declined it, and they sat down. "Cutter is buying," Solomon said when she had told them what Aldridge had confirmed. "He's been buying north of here, too. The Hennessy parcel and the old Parker land. 3,000 acres in the last 18 months. Assembling. Reed, who had come in from his evening check of the horses, pulled out the chair across from Dawes and dropped into it. He's assembling the whole basin. Everything except Painted Canyon. Solomon looked at her steadily. Which is why the Boone outfit showed up yesterday. Which is why they'll show up again. Not just show up, Dawes said. His voice was low and careful with consonants. They'll escalate. The morning test was to see if you'd fold or call for help or go quiet. You did none of those. So the next move is harder. He paused. That's how Boone's crew operates. I've tracked them twice before, down in the Panhandle country. They test first, then they push. When, she said. Not if. Dawes looked at his hands. Days. Maybe a week. They won't wait for you to get organized. She thought about the south fence, about the cut wire, and the bright new splice and the compacted soil on both sides of the post and the heel print in the loose dirt at the base. She thought about the mine entrance she could see from the fence line, the marks of regular work in the earth below it. She thought about the notebook inside her vest, which she had not put down since she found it, which she had folded into her vest pocket, with the care she would give to something she did not want to lose, because she was not going to lose it, and she was not going to lose this land. And she was not going to stand still while Harlan Cutter completed the assembly he had started, and then sold the whole of what her family had built to a territorial governor who had never worked a day of it with his hands. We should talk about what we have, she said, and what we can make of it. They talked until the lamp oil burned low. Solomon spread his knowledge of the terrain, the draws and gullies and rock formations that Dawes had spent years learning to use. The ways that a small number of people who understood the ground could make themselves effective against a larger number who did not. Dawes sketched positions in the air with his hands, and then on a piece of paper she gave him, rough diagrams of approaches and sightlines and the natural choke points where the ranch's geography became an ally. Reed contributed what he knew about the fence lines and the water sources and the approaches from the Tucson Road, which he had been memorizing with new intent, ever since she had told him at 4 a.m. what she understood. She listened and asked questions and stored everything she heard in the organized way she had always stored useful information, ready to be retrieved when it was needed rather than held in front of her as a comfort. At some point during the evening she realized that she was not afraid, had not been afraid since she found the notebook, since the shape of the thing had become clear enough to think about rather than just feel. Fear was what she had been carrying for 2 years, the particular fear of not knowing, of the official version of James's death sitting in her like something she could not digest and could not expel. Now she knew, and knowing, even when what you know is terrible, is different from not knowing in a way that reorders everything. What she felt now was something she recognized from other times in her life, from the years of the hard droughts, and the year the bank had threatened to call the loan, and the year Reed was sick for 3 months, and the doctor's face had been carefully neutral in a way that told her he was not certain, a kind of locked-in attention. All the things that were not immediately relevant falling away, leaving only the shape of the problem and the tools available to address it. The night was full dark by the time Solomon and Dawes went to the barn to sleep, which they had done before in seasons of necessity, and which they did without ceremony now. Reed checked the bar on the front door and the back door and went upstairs. She did not go upstairs. She sat for a while at the kitchen table alone. The ranch was quiet around her in the way that contained rather than empty, the animals in the barn going through their nighttime processes, the land outside doing what it did at night, cooling slowly, adjusting, holding what it held. She took the notebook out of her vest pocket and put it on the table, looked at it, did not open it. She had read it enough that the words were inside her now, carried the way you carry things that have changed your understanding of what happened. She thought about what Aldridge had said. $40,000. The number was large enough to explain everything, to explain Cutter's patience, and his ruthlessness, and his willingness to put a governor's name on a fraudulent mineral rights transaction, and hire a Texas outfit and arrange a hunting accident that ended a man's life, large enough to explain all of it. But it was her number. Her land's number. Whatever lay under the south pasture lay under it because the ground was what it was, because the geology ran the way it ran, because 4 generations of her family had worked this specific earth rather than some other earth. If there was wealth under Painted Canyon Ranch, it was Painted Canyon Ranch's wealth, not Cutter's. She was not going to let Cutter have it. The sound came just after midnight. Not a loud sound. That was the first thing. Something that the night absorbed rather than announced. A scrape, and then a shift in the air, the way the air shifts when something that was still is now in motion. The horses would hear it before she could, and she listened for them, for any change in the barn sounds. And there it was, the faint shift in midnight's movements that said the dark mare had noticed something. She was up from the table before the thought was complete. Winchester in her hand, hat on her head, boots already on because she had not taken them off. She went to the south window first, not the door. Looked out through the glass at the barn and the paddock and the stretch of ground between the house and the south fence. 3 shapes. Moving toward the barn from the south, staying low, using the shadow of the fence line and then the shadow of the equipment shed. They were not moving fast. Would you treat them with kindness? They were moving with the patience of who had planned this carefully, who had scouted the approach, who knew where the lights were and where the angles were and where a person watching from the house would be likely to look. She was not watching from where they expected. She went to the back of the house, to the door that opened west toward the root cellar entrance, and she slipped out into the darkness without using the lamp. The air outside was cool and smelled of dust and creosote and the particular dry sweetness of an Arizona night that has held its heat all day and is only now beginning to give it up. She moved along the back of the house, keeping to the shadow of the wall, until she could see around the south corner toward the barn. From here she could see that the 3 figures had separated, 2 heading for the barn doors and 1 moving toward the paddock where Midnight Storm was penned. Midnight Storm again. Not a coincidence. Not a test this time. This was the message that the test had been preparing. Her right hand found the knife at her belt. The Winchester was in her left, but the Winchester was for problems she could not solve with precision, and precision was what this moment called for. She moved out from the shadow of the house wall and into the open ground between the house and the barn, moving the way Solomon had taught her to move since she was a child. Weight forward, weight controlled. Each step placed deliberately, the whole body committed to silence rather than speed. The nearest figure was 10 feet from the paddock gate when she came up behind him. She did not give him a warning. Warnings were for situations where the alternative was acceptable. She came up behind him and put the blade flat against his throat and her knee into the back of his left leg and spoke directly into his ear with a voice that was barely above breath. Don't. He went still, completely still. The stillness of a man who has just understood his situation. Hands out, she said. Palms up, he extended his hands. She could see them in the moonlight, empty, shaking slightly. How many? A demand, not a question, a pause. The blade pressed slightly. 3, he managed. Just us 3. She did not believe him, but she believed that was all he knew about. She had him down and bound with the leather cord from her vest in 40 seconds, using the knots she had used on the 2 horse thieves that morning, which felt like several years ago now. She left him face down in the dirt and moved to the barn. The 2 figures at the barn doors had heard nothing. This told her they were confident, which was a disadvantage she appreciated. She came around the south end of the barn wall and saw them clearly in the moonlight, close enough now to see that they were not the same men from the morning. Different men. Boone's outfit had more members than the 2 she had taken, which she had expected. One had his hand on the barn door latch. From the top of the barn the sound came. A single sharp knock, the back of a rifle butt against the roof boards. Reed, who was supposed to be inside the house, who was evidently not inside the house, who had apparently made his own decision about where he needed to be. Both figures at the barn door spun toward the sound, both of them looking up, neither of them looking behind. She had the nearer one before he found his footing again. The second tried to run and made it 4 steps before he hit the tripwire she had strung along the south face of the barn at ankle height 2 hours earlier, when she had still not been sure whether tonight was the night and had decided it was better to be ready than to be wrong. He went down hard on the packed earth and lay there for a moment, with the particular stillness of someone who has had the wind removed from them by the ground. She was on him before he recovered it. The whole of it, start to finish, had taken 11 minutes. Reed came down from the barn roof using the ladder at the north end, which she had not known was there, and which told her he had put it there himself, planned his position before she knew he was planning anything. He dropped into the paddock, checked on Midnight Storm, who was agitated but unharmed, and came around to where she stood over the second bound figure. His flannel shirt had come untucked, and he was breathing harder than he would have liked her to notice. But his hands were steady. His face was the face he used when he had decided on something and done it, and was now at peace with having done it. "You were supposed to be inside," she said. "You were supposed to have backup. A silence. The kind that contains a renegotiation. Next time you tell me." She looked at him. "Whether I'll like it or not, same to you." She almost said something else, did not. Let it stand where it was. They were finishing securing the third man when the sound of hooves came from the north. Not the measured approach of someone coming in quietly. A horse being ridden hard, directly. Coming from the direction of the Tucson road, coming fast. She was on her feet with the Winchester up before she identified the horse. But she identified it fast. The roan going gray at the muzzle. Clem Porter riding his horse hard in the middle of the night toward a ranch where 3 members of the Boone outfit were currently tied up in the dirt. She did not lower the Winchester. Porter pulled up 50 feet from where she stood and took in the scene in the way people take in things they did not expect to find. The 3 bound figures. Her with the rifle. Reed beside her. The barn undamaged. The paddock holding its horses. Nora. His voice came out differently than she had ever heard it. Stripped of the deliberate composure. Just the man underneath. And the man underneath was not managing well. "I didn't know they were coming tonight. I swear to you I didn't know. Why are you here, Clem?" "Because I got word that something was planned and I rode out." He stayed on his horse. Did not come closer. Perhaps understood that the distance was what she was allowing him and that coming closer was not his decision to make. "I've been riding out when I get word. Trying to make sure." He stopped. Started again. "Trying to make sure nothing happened to you or the boy. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't undo anything. I'm not asking you to receive it as payment. I'm just telling you what I've been doing." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had been James's friend since before she knew either of them. At the badge on his coat. At the horse breathing hard from the ride it had just made. At the hands on the reins that were not as steady as they had been this morning. "Dismount," she said. "Tie your horse." He dismounted, tied his horse. "Then come inside and tell me everything you know." She lowered the Winchester but did not put it away. "Everything, Clem. Not the version that makes it easier, everything." He walked toward the house with the gait of a man carrying more than his own weight. She watched him walk and thought about James writing in his notebook about not being sure if Porter was still his man. Thought about the gap between knowing you have done wrong and doing something about the knowing. Thought about the fact that he had ridden hard in the middle of the night to a ranch he believed was under threat, which was not the action of a man who was entirely lost, though it was also not enough. Not enough by itself. But perhaps enough to be useful. Reed fell in beside her and they followed Porter to the house and she put the kettle on the stove because the night was going to be long and what Porter had to tell her would need to be told in full and the full telling would need to be sustained by more than what either of them had already. Outside, the desert held the 3 bound men on the ground and held its temperature and held the marks of boots and hooves and the scuffle of a brief fight that would fade in a few days as the ground returned to its own concerns. And further out, in the hills to the south, the old Wilson mine sat with its darkness and its copper and its recent marks of equipment, sitting and waiting the way ground waits, which is forever, without urgency, knowing that the urgency belongs to the people above it and not to what lies below. She had tied 3 men tonight. She had asked a compromised marshal to sit at her kitchen table and account for himself. She had moved through her own land in darkness and come out the other side of it without injury. But what was coming was larger than tonight. She understood that with the same certainty she's understood the fence wire and the wagon fence wire and the wagon tracks, and the number that had sat in her kitchen that morning and changed the dimensions of everything. Cutter was not finished. Cutter had not committed himself this far to be turned back by a widow who knew how to throw a lasso and move quietly in the dark. She was not finished either. The kettle began to heat. Porter sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands. The night outside was what Arizona nights were, enormous and indifferent and full of things that were happening in it, whether anyone witnessed them or not. She sat down across from the marshal who had not protected her husband and said, with a steadiness that came from somewhere below her breastbone, somewhere that felt older than her individual life, "Start from the beginning, Clem, and don't decide what I need to know. Tell me all of it." He looked at her, looked at the table, and began. Porter talked for 2 hours. He talked with his hat still in his hands and the coffee going cold in front of him and the lamp burning down between them on the kitchen table. And he did not once try to make himself sound better than he was, which was the only thing she had asked of him and the thing that cost him the most. She could see it costing him. The careful man's composure, the deliberate face she had known for 15 years, cracking along seams she had not known were there because she had not known to look for them before tonight. It had started 3 years ago. Cutter had come to him privately, not at the office, at the saloon in Tucson on a Tuesday evening when the place was quiet, and the timing said the choice of venue was deliberate. He had laid out what he knew about Porter's gambling debts from the bad year after his wife left, had laid it out without malice, almost administratively, the way a banker discusses numbers. He had asked for nothing that first meeting. He had simply let Porter understand the shape of what he was holding. The second meeting 2 weeks later, Cutter had made his proposal. Not running operations. Not facilitating violence. Just routing. Just making sure that on certain nights, patrols went east when they might have gone south. That certain complaints were logged slowly. That the machinery of the law, which moved at its own pace regardless, moved at a slightly more accommodating pace on specific matters. Simple, Cutter had called it. Low risk. Well compensated. Porter had said no that second time. He repeated this with a steadiness that she believed, because it was the kind of detail a man trying to minimize himself would leave out. He had said no, and Cutter had nodded and thanked him for his time and left. And 2 days later, a letter had arrived at the office addressed to the territorial court documenting Porter's gambling debts in full, unsigned, with a note attached that said simply, "Filed pending." The threat did not need explaining. Porter had understood it the way you understand a drawn gun. He had gone back to Cutter the following week, and so it started. The routing of patrols, the slow processing of certain reports, the occasional look in the other direction on a night when it needed to be looked in. He told himself it was contained. He told himself nobody was being hurt. He was a man who had a particular talent for the story that made his choices livable, and he had exercised that talent thoroughly for nearly 2 years. Then James Calloway had come to his office with a notebook and a careful account of tracks and cut fence wire and night movement on the south boundary of his ranch. Porter set his coffee cup down on the table with a small, precise sound. The sound of a man marking a moment. "He came to me because he trusted me," Porter said. His voice scraped down to something that was trying to be level and not quite making it. 15 years of friendship. He trusted me the way you trust someone who has been beside you through enough that you stop questioning it. She did not say anything. Let him carry the weight of his own words. I told him I would look into it. I did not look into it. I went to Cutter instead and told him that James had evidence and was moving toward the federal authorities. He stopped. The lamp threw his shadow large and still against the wall. I told myself Cutter would just redirect the wagon route, move the operation, that James would find nothing further and the matter would quiet down. A pause long enough to be its own kind of statement. I was wrong about what Cutter would do, and I have carried that being wrong every day since. Nora looked at the man across the table. She had known Clem Porter for 15 years. She had shaken his hand at her wedding. She had watched him stand at James's graveside with what she had taken for genuine grief. She now understood that the grief had been genuine. That was the complicated and terrible thing about it. The grief was real, which meant the man who had caused the death was also capable of mourning it, which meant the categories she had for people were not sufficient for what Porter actually was. "You said you found out after," she said. What Cutter had done. When? The week after the inquest. A man who worked the operation, one of the freight handlers, came to me drunk and afraid and told me what had happened. That 2 men had been sent to intercept James on the South Range. That it was supposed to be a warning only. A confrontation. That something had gone differently than planned. Porter's hands tightened on the hat brim. I have never been able to determine whether Cutter ordered what happened or whether it escalated beyond what he intended. I don't know if that distinction matters. It doesn't, she said. And then, after a moment, not to me. She stood up, moved to the window. The ranch outside was quiet. The 3 bound men still on the ground near the barn, where she and Reed had left them. The stars overhead doing what stars do, which is persist without caring whether you look at them or not. "You will write down everything you have told me tonight," she said. "All of it. Every name, every date, every instruction Cutter gave you, and every compliance you gave back, you will sign it. And you will be prepared to say it again in front of Frank Aldridge and again in front of whatever court convenes. She did not turn from the window. Is that agreed? Yes, no pause, no calculation, just the word. And you understand what happens to you when you do. I expect the badge goes. I expect there are consequences. Something shifted in his voice, the sound of a man who has reached the end of a burden he has been carrying too long and found that setting it down, even into consequences, was lighter than holding it. I expect there should be. She turned from the window, looked at him across the room. James knew things were worth fighting for even when fighting them cost something, she said. He was going to do this. He was going to pay whatever it cost and do it anyway. You can do it now. It doesn't give him back. But it's the right direction. Porter nodded once with the entirety of himself and said nothing more. The morning arrived the way Arizona mornings arrived when you had not slept, which was suddenly and without sympathy. She was in the yard at 5:30, working through the animal care that structured every day regardless of what the night had been, because the horses required water and feeding independent of what the humans around them were managing or failing to manage, and that reliability was one of the things she valued most about animals. They did not adjust their needs to your circumstances. Aldridge arrived at 8, with 2 deputies who did not look like ranch hands but were at least wearing the right clothes, canvas and leather and worn boots, and she set them to work on the east fence line and watched them from the paddock for 20 minutes and decided they would pass a casual inspection if no one looked closely. She gave Aldridge the 3 men from the previous night, and she gave him Porter's signed statement, which Porter had written at the kitchen table by lamplight, while Reed slept in the chair by the stove, and she sat across watching to make sure he did not edit himself. Aldridge read the statement with the face of a man assembling a larger picture from a piece he had been missing. He asked her 3 questions about the timing of the wagon traffic. He noted the location of the fence modification. He looked at the statement again. "This is enough to move on Cutter," he said. "Not yet enough to move on Pruitt. We'll need something more direct on the governor's involvement." "The mine," she said. "Whatever documentation Cutter has been keeping about the operation there, the production records, the survey results, the correspondence with Pruitt about the mineral rights transaction. That's where the direct connection will be. We can't access the mine without proper legal standing. Not with Pruitt in the picture." "I know," she looked at him steadily. "I can." Aldridge opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with, the reassessment expression. "Mrs. Calloway, it's my land the mine road runs across. I have cause to inspect activity on my property boundary. If what I find in the course of that inspection happens to include documentation left at the mine entrance or in the vicinity, that documentation was found on or adjacent to my land and I picked it up." She watched his face process this. "I'm not suggesting you instruct me to do anything, I'm telling you what I'm going to do." A silence. A long one. "If you encounter anyone at the mine," Aldridge said carefully, "you are to withdraw immediately and come to me." "Of course." She said it easily. She meant part of it. She and Reed rode out to the Wilson mine property in the late morning, taking the long way, the route that came at them from the north along the ridge line, rather than across the south fence, which gave them higher ground and a view of the approaches. The day was building toward its full heat, the sky gone from morning blue to the paler, harder shade that said the temperature would be serious by noon. The mine entrance was as she had seen it from the fence line, a rectangular cut in the red rock face, shored with old timber that had been supplemented with newer posts in the past year or 2. The supplementation visible if you knew what old timber looked like against new. The chain-link fence Cutter's men had put up across the entrance was padlocked with a new lock. The signage on it named a geological assessment company she had never heard of and gave no address. She studied the ground around the entrance. The marks of equipment and foot traffic she had seen from a distance were more specific up close. Or drag marks in the dirt, the distinctive parallel lines left by heavy loads being moved along the ground rather than carried. Boot prints from multiple people, overlapping in a way that said regular use over weeks rather than a single event. Tailing piles to the east of the entrance. Fresh rock broken and piled, the copper-green oxidation on the newly exposed surfaces bright in the morning light. They were not done with this mine. They had not played it out. They were producing copper from it actively. moving it across her land to the road, and had been for long enough to have established the whole infrastructure of doing it quietly. Reed crouched at the base of the fence near the east side of the entrance. He was looking at something in the dirt that she had not yet seen. When she came to him, he pointed without touching. A piece of paper, folded twice, lodged against the base of the fence post as if it had been caught there by the wind. The kind of document that someone carried and dropped without knowing. She picked it up, unfolded it. It was a bill of lading, handwritten, dated 4 days ago. It documented a transfer of copper ore, listed by weight and grade, from a point of origin identified only as WP, which she understood immediately to stand for Wilson Property, to a transfer point on the old Cutter Road north of Tucson. The receiver's name at the top of the bill was Harold Fitch, which she did not recognize. But at the bottom, in a different hand, a notation. Approved by H.C. per Gov's standing order. H.C. Harlan Cutter. Gov. Governor. It was not everything, but it was a link. A specific operational document tying the mine's output to Cutter and to a standing arrangement with the governor's office that had authorized it. The kind of document that Aldridge had said they needed. Not identical to what he had described, but made of the same material. She folded it carefully, put it inside her vest against the notebook. Then she straightened and looked at the mine entrance and said to the darkness inside it, and to Cutter, wherever he was, and to whatever larger force had decided that this land and what was under it was worth her husband's life, not yours. None of this is yours. They were riding back toward the ranch when the two riders came off the south approach at a canter. Not aggressive, not threatening, but purposeful in a way that said the arrival was not accidental. Both men were in suits unsuitable for the terrain, territorial business suits, the kind worn in offices and meeting rooms, with the dust of hard riding now on them. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Southwestern Mineral Syndicate. They had the controlled courtesy of men who had been briefed on how to have this conversation. They expressed concern for her safety given recent events. They expressed their employer's continued interest in acquiring the ranch property at a price they described as generous, which they then named, and which was considerably higher than any of Cutter's 3 letters had offered. She listened to all of it. Let them finish. Then, who sent you? We represent the syndicate. Who at the syndicate gave you the price you just offered me? A pause. Mrs. Calloway, the details of our client relationships are confidential, I see. She sat thunder with her hands loose on the reins. I'll make this simple. The answer to any offer to purchase this property is no. It was no when Mr. Cutter sent letters. It is no today. It will be no tomorrow and in a year from now, and in whatever form the offer takes between now and then. The land is not for sale, and the reason it is not for sale is not price. Do you understand that distinction? The nearer man looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not anger. Something more considered than anger. The expression of a man recalculating, updating what he had been told to expect against what he was finding. There are other ways this can proceed, the farther man said. Not a threat exactly. A statement of a range of possibilities that included threatening ones. I expect there are, she said. And I expect you'll find, as others have recently, that this particular piece of ground is harder to move than it looks. She turned thunder north toward the ranch without another word and did not look back, though she tracked the sounds of their horses carefully until she was certain they were moving away rather than following. Reed rode beside her in silence for a half-mile. Then, Cutter's moving faster. He's cornered on the financial side. The rights he sold Pruitt are contingent on getting this land, and he sold them before he had them. And the people he sold them to are not patient men. She watched a red-tail hawk ride a thermal above the eastern ridge without effort, making the work of staying aloft look like rest. He'll send someone himself next. Not through intermediaries. You think he'll come here? I think he wants to see what kind of woman he's dealing with before he decides on his next move. Men like Cutter need to make that assessment personally. They don't trust other people's read of the situation. She paused. Which means we'll be face to face with him soon. And I want to be ready for that conversation. What she did not say was that she was also thinking about what ready meant when Cutter was not alone in this. When behind him was a governor's signature on a standing order, and behind that was the full weight of territorial authority that could slow or redirect or simply ignore a federal investigation if properly applied. Aldridge was federal, which gave him some insulation from territorial interference, but some was not complete, and complete was what this required. Porter was recovering in the small room off the barn that she had set up with a cot and water and clean bandaging. The wound from the previous night, a graze along his left side from Tate Boone's gun before Boone went down, was not serious in the medical sense, but it was significant in the symbolic one. The mark of the moment he had finally chosen the side he should have chosen. Before James went out alone on a November morning, she brought him his noon meal herself. Set it down on the cot beside him. He looked better than he had at dawn, the color returning, the shaking in his hands resolved. He was reading James's statement back from his own written account, checking it against something only he could check it against. The man from the freight operation, she said, still standing, not sitting. The one who came to you drunk after the inquest. Is he findable? Porter looked up, considered, possibly. He was working out of Wilcox at the time. If he's still in the territory, his testimony would support yours. It would be the difference between my word and documented corroboration. He set the papers aside. I can write out what I know of him. Description, last known situation, habits. Dawes might be able to find him. Write it. She moved toward the door. Stopped. The first time you said no to Cutter. Before the second meeting. When you still had the choice cleanly. She did not turn around. I want you to hold on to that. The fact that it existed. When you're in front of a court, it won't change the outcome much. But it's true and you should be able to say it. She did not wait for him to respond. She went back to the work of the day, which was the ranch's ordinary demands continuing their ordinary pressure regardless of everything else. Because ranches did not pause for the complications of the people who ran them, and she had always respected that about them. Solomon arrived in the afternoon, with Dawes and two cousins of Dawes named Wick and Hollis, who were younger and quieter and moved through the landscape with the same diminished impression as Dawes himself, as if they had been trained since childhood to take up less space than they occupied. She gave them coffee and showed them the property map and laid out what she knew about the probable timeline. Cutter was going to escalate. The syndicate representatives this morning were not the escalation. They were the step before it, the last version of the polite approach before something harder came. The Boone outfit had suffered losses. 3 men in custody with Aldridge, the 3 from the previous night, added to the 2 from the horse theft. Whatever remained of Boone's crew was either gone or waiting for new instructions. The new instructions, when they came, would not be for tests or messages. He'll hire new men, Dawes said. He was looking at the property map with the particular attention of someone who reads terrain as language. Different kind this time, not outfit riders. Specialists. Men who are paid to complete things rather than to intimidate. How much time? Dawes turned to Solomon. Solomon turned the question over in the way he turned all questions, with the slowness that was not hesitation but thoroughness. 3 days, the older man said, maybe 4. He needs to find them and get them here. That's not fast, but it's not slow. Then we have 3 days to finish what we're building. She looked around the table at the 5 men assembled there, Reed and Solomon and Dawes and the 2 cousins, all of them quiet and watching her, all of them here because they had chosen to be, which was a different thing than obligation and a more substantial one. And we used them fully. The 3 days were not 3 days of waiting. They were 3 days of preparation so thorough that the ranch began to feel less like a home and more like an argument being assembled, every element of the terrain around it considered for its potential function in a conflict she could not prevent but could shape. Solomon and Dawes moved through the property like people reading a text they had read before in a different language, pointing out features she had lived beside for decades without registering as tactical. The dip in the south paddock ground that provided natural concealment, the rocky outcroppings along the north ridge, where a rifle could be positioned with the moon behind the shooter rather than in front, the equipment shed with its multiple exits that could be used for repositioning in ways the shed's original builder had not intended. She learned from them. She had always been a student of the land she lived on, but she understood now that she had been a student of the land in its agricultural dimension, its productive one, the dimension that sustained and fed and sheltered. She had not learned it as a terrain, as a set of positions and angles and natural advantages that could be employed in a contest. Solomon and Dawes were teaching her that second language, and she was learning it fast because she had always been a fast learner when the subject mattered. Reed worked alongside them with an intensity that was almost alarming in its focus. He had always been industrious, had always applied himself, But there was something different in the quality of his attention now, something that had clarified since the night with the barn roof and the decision he had made without consulting her. He was not following instructions. He was thinking. He was looking at the same terrain she was looking at and arriving at his own conclusions about it. And sometimes those conclusions preceded hers and she let them, because the point was not who got there first, but that they got there. On the second afternoon, Aldridge came back to the ranch with news that was two kinds of news at once. The first kind, the three men from the barn night were federal witnesses now, had provided testimony that filled in operational details of the route across her property and confirmed the connection between that route and the Wilson mine. The bill of lading she had found was in federal custody and was being authenticated. Enough was assembling on Cutter that Aldridge believed they could move on him within the week. The second kind of news, word from a contact in Tucson that someone had been asking about hiring specialists. Former military men, the kind who had come back from the war with skills that had limited peacetime applications unless you were willing to work in certain markets. 4 men. The contract had apparently been finalized. They're already hired, she said. The information suggests they were hired yesterday, which meant the 3 days was an optimistic estimate, which meant they might have 1 day, possibly 2, before something came at the ranch that was materially different from anything that had come before. She thanked Aldridge for the information. She did not tell him what she was thinking. What she was thinking was about the Sharps rifle that had been her father's, and then James's, the octagonal barrel, and the walnut stock, and the long, unforgiving accuracy of it in the hands of someone who had been shooting since childhood. What she was thinking was about the ridge to the north of the ranch house, the high point of the property, the position from which you could see everything below you and be seen by nothing above, because there was nothing above. What she was thinking was that she was done waiting for things to happen to her. The last 2 years she had been waiting, had been absorbing the shape of what had happened to James and to her land and to her life, had been a widow doing what widows were expected to do, which was survive and endure and diminish. She had survived. She had endured. She was done with the diminishing. She went to the Caro lamp after dinner, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she wrote out a full account of what she knew, everything from the notebook to the bill of lading to Porter's statement to what Aldridge had told her about the specialist hires, and she put it in an envelope addressed to the federal court in Tucson, to be sent with Aldridge's next courier, so that whatever happened in the days ahead would have its record somewhere that Cutter and Pruitt could not reach. Reed came in while she was sealing the envelope and sat down across from her without asking what it was. She told him anyway. Insurance, she said. If something goes wrong, this record exists. Nothing's going to go wrong. I believe that. I'm also a rancher. A rancher insures. She looked at her son, at his father's hands on the table and her father's eyes in his face. You understand what I want from you if things get complicated tomorrow night or the night after. Stay with the plan. Don't do anything that isn't the plan. And if the plan changes, come to you first. He paused. Unless coming to you first makes things worse. She thought about it. Use your judgment, she said. But know that your judgment and your life are worth more to me than any outcome, and I need you to know that going in. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not fully name, something in the neighborhood of the look he had given her when he was 7 years old and had fallen from the barn roof trying to retrieve a kite, and she had run to him across the yard with her heart in her throat. The look of someone who had frightened themselves and been caught by something larger than the fright. I know, he said. I've always known. She reached across the table and put her hand over both of his for a moment briefly, the way she had done when he was small, and it was all the comfort either of them needed. Then she stood up and she took the rifle down from the wall, and she began cleaning it with the same thoroughness she had always brought to everything that mattered, the cloth moving along the octagonal barrel in steady strokes. The mechanism checked and rechecked, the work itself a kind of preparation that went beyond the mechanical, a settling of the self into what was coming. Outside, the Arizona night was building towards something. She could feel it in the air, the way her grandfather had told her you could feel weather before it arrived. Not in any single sensation, but in the quality of everything at once. The way the land held itself slightly differently, when something significant was preparing to move across it. She cleaned the rifle until it was done. Then she sat with it across her knees in the dark kitchen and let the night pass around her, And she thought about James, and about the ground under the south pasture that he had felt through the soles of his boots long before anyone had names for what it contained, and about the fact that some things are worth the cost of protecting them, not because the protection is certain to succeed, but because the alternative, the standing aside, the letting go, is a cost she had never been built to pay. The lamp burned down. She did not replace it. She sat in the dark and waited for what was coming, the way the land waited, which was with everything it was and had ever been, patient and particular and absolute. The trunk had been in the storage room for 2 years, 3 months, and some number of days she had stopped counting. Cedar wood, iron-banded, the initials JC burned into the lid. She had walked past it every time she went to the storage room for wire or harness parts or the spare lamp oil kept on the shelf above it, had walked past it with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided not to look at a thing directly, because looking directly requires a decision about what to do next, and the time for that decision has not yet arrived. The time had arrived. She moved the canvas cover, lifted the lid on the same key from the ring she carried every day, the key indistinguishable from the one to the grain store or the tack room, which she now understood was deliberate, James making the significant thing look ordinary so its significance was his alone to know. Inside, under waterproofed canvas, the Sharps rifle she already had and had been maintaining, the military cartridge box, half full, sealed and dry, a leather dispatch case, signal mirrors in brass frames, the coil of good rope, and in the bottom corner a folded envelope she had not seen before. Her name on the front, his handwriting. She did not open it in the storage room. She carried it to the kitchen, to the table, and she poured water from the pitcher and drank it standing, because she needed the moment that drinking required. Then she sat down and broke the seal. He had written it over time. She could tell from the internal references, coming back to it across several weeks of the last months of his life. The early rains, the colt with the bad leg, his brother's unanswered letter from Kansas. He had been adding to this the way a careful man adds to things he is not finished thinking about. He told her about the copper first, about the rough survey he had done himself with a measuring rod and a compass, and a geological pamphlet ordered from a Denver printer, working out what the ground under the south pasture held, because he had felt it for years, in the way the soil sat heavy in the south, and the way water ran away from specific areas, and the color of the rock outcroppings in the low hills. He believed it was substantial. He had not known precisely how substantial until he found the marks of the syndicate's own survey, and understood from the care they took that the deposit was worth that care. He told her he was frightened. He wrote the word without apology or reduction, the way he had always said hard things, directly and without performance. Not for himself, he clarified. For her, for Reed, for the ranch. He understood the size of what was ranged against them, and he was one man on 1,800 acres, and the only tools available to him were the honesty of the land's own evidence and the careful record of what he had observed. He had not told her, he wrote, because he did not want to deliver the problem without delivering the beginning of its solution at the same time. He had not wanted to hand her only the dark. He was sorry, he wrote, that this had not been how it worked out. And then the last paragraph, shorter than the others, written in a hand that was slightly less controlled than the rest, as if speed had been required. You have always been stronger than you knew. Not in spite of what you have carried, but because of how you have chosen to carry it. This land knows you. It has known you since before you could name what that knowing meant. Whatever comes, trust that. Trust the ground under your feet. It remembers who has loved it honestly, and it will not abandon the people who have stood on it faithfully. I am sorry I cannot be beside you for what comes next. I would have chosen differently if the choice had been mine. Love the land, raise our son. Do not let them have what is ours. I trust you with all of it, I always have. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time, not crying, not yet, and then yes, quietly, in the way she had cried in the first weeks after his death, without sound, the tears simply arriving and running, and being what they were without drama or management. She had told herself she was past this. She understood now that past this was not a place you arrived at permanently, but a condition that held until something broke it open again with sufficient precision. This broke it open with precision. What moved through her, alongside the grief, was something she had not expected, something that reordered a weight she had been carrying without recognizing its full shape. She had believed in the 2 years of his absence that he had kept things from her out of some version of the old instinct men carried, the instinct to manage difficult things alone and present the outcome rather than the process. She had never blamed him for it, had understood it as the shape of him, but it had sat in her as a small, persistent sadness beneath the larger one. The feeling of having been left out of the last thing that mattered. She could put that down now. He had not left her out. He had been trying to protect her until he could bring the protection and the truth in the same hand, and the world had not given him the time. She folded the letter back into the envelope, with the care she would give something she intended to keep without limit, put it in the inside pocket of her vest, against her left side, where the notebook already lived, so that both things were present against her when she went out into what was coming. She sat for a while longer. The kitchen held its ordinary quiet around her, the banked coals in the stove, the sound of the horses from the barn, the settling sounds of the house at night. She was not in a hurry. Some things needed their full duration before the next thing could begin, and she gave this one its duration, sitting in the kitchen that had been the center of everything for the past several days, and letting herself be what she was, which was a woman who had just been handed back a piece of herself she had not known was missing. Then she stood up, dried her face with the back of her hand the efficient way, pulled her hat down, and went to find Solomon. He was at the barn, which was where he was most evenings now, tending his horse with the unhurried thoroughness that characterized everything he did. She told him what was in the letter. Not all of it. The essential parts. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he knew the size of it and he went anyway. He went anyway. Good man, Solomon said. Not an eulogy. A simple, accurate statement about a person's character, the kind that carries more weight for its simplicity. She looked out the barn door toward the south pasture. Dawes's information. The specialist hires. Do we still think 2 days? I think 1. Solomon set down the brush. Looked at her with the flat directness of someone who has decided that what the person in front of him needs is accuracy rather than comfort. The visit from Cutter's representatives yesterday. The way they spoke to you. That was final assessment, not continued negotiation. Cutter knows what he's dealing with now and he's made his decision. Men like the ones Dawes described don't wait once the contract is agreed. Then we have tonight. We have tonight, Solomon said. She went to find Reed. He was on the porch, which was where she expected him, the colt cleaned and reassembled on the rail beside him and a cup of coffee in his hand, and the particular quality of stillness that meant he had been sitting there thinking rather than resting. He looked up when she came out, and she told him what was in the letter, briefly, the essential parts, because he deserved to know tonight rather than after, and because what his father had written about trust applied to the two of them as much as it applied to the land. Reed listened with his hands around the coffee cup, and his eyes on the south pasture in the middle distance. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that the quiet became its own response. He knew, Reed said finally. He knew, and he was handling it the only way he knew how. Another silence. Then, in a voice that was trying for level and achieving something close to it, I wish he'd told us. So do I. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. But he told us now, and we're going to do what he asked. Reed nodded once. Set the coffee cup down. What do we need to do before dark? They worked through the remaining daylight hours with the focused efficiency of people who have a specific task and a limited time window, and no interest in anything that does not directly serve the task. Solomon and Dawes positioned the signal mirrors at 3 points on the property, the brass frames catching the last of the afternoon light, each mirror angled to communicate to a specific other position, without requiring sound or movement through open ground. Wick and Hollis Dawes' cousins, who had been at the ranch for 3 days now, and had learned its geography with the attention of people who understood that geography was the difference between an advantage and a liability, took their positions at the eastern and western approaches. But she changed the plan in one essential way. She had been preparing for 3 days for a fight on her own terms, on ground she knew, using the darkness and the terrain and the Apache tactics Solomon had been teaching her since childhood. That preparation was still good, but she had been preparing to win the same way she had won the previous 2 nights, which was by being where the enemy did not expect her, by moving through the dark with more authority than they could match. Tonight she needed something different, because the 3rd night was the one where the pattern could kill her. 3 nights of the same approach meant that whoever Cutter had hired, if they were as good as Dawes believed, had possibly been briefed on the first 2 nights, had possibly studied what had happened to the Boone outfit, had adjusted. She needed to not be where she had been. She explained this to Solomon in the late afternoon, standing at the equipment shed where she could see the south approach and the ridge and the east fence all at once. "The previous nights I was moving," she said. "I was the one who found them and came at them from the unexpected angle. If they've been told about the previous nights, they'll expect movement. They'll expect me to circle." She paused. "So I don't circle. I find one position and I hold it. I let them come to me rather than going to them. And I use the sharps." Solomon looked at the north ridge, the high ground that dominated the entire property from above. The ridge. 200 yards gives me the whole south approach, the barn, the east side of the house. From up there with the sharps, I control the ground below without moving through it. They may send someone for the high ground. Then Dawes covers the ridge approach from the east slope. She had already talked to Dawes. He had already agreed with the quiet decisiveness she had come to expect from him. And Reed watches the house from inside. Not the barn roof. Inside with the doors barred, because if they're smarter than the previous crews, they'll know someone's been on that roof. Solomon considered this for a moment. "You're reversing the tactic." "I'm reversing the tactic. Previous nights I brought the fight to them. Tonight I make them bring it to me, on ground I control from above. And if they don't approach from the south, then we adapt." She looked at him. "But they'll come from the south. The south is where the darkness is deepest and the cover is best, and the approaches are multiple. If they're professionals, they'll use the best approach." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your grandfather once told me that the greatest tactical advantage is not strength or surprise. It is making the enemy move according to your understanding of them rather than their understanding of themselves." He looked at her. He was right. She was on the ridge before full dark. She had climbed it in the last of the evening light, which gave her time to settle into position, to learn the specific geography of the rock she was using for cover, to establish her sight lines to the south and southwest and to the barn and the east side of the house. The sharps was heavy, but she had been carrying its weight since she was old enough to handle it, and her body knew how to manage it, had long ago worked out the adjustments of breath and arm angle that made the weight disappear into function. The night came in from the east, the way Arizona nights always came, the darkness filling from the far edge of the sky inward, gradual and then complete. The moon was a few days past half, giving reasonable light across the open ground below her. The ranch was visible from the ridge with the clarity of a map, every building and fence line and paddock visible as shapes distinguished from each other by their different darknesses. She was lying flat on the broadest section of the rock, the sharps extended over the forward edge, her body positioned so the rock's mass was between her and anything approaching from below. She had been in this position for 40 minutes before the horses told her. Not the barn horses directly. The sound came from thunder, and it was not the sound he made for ordinary night disturbances, for the small creatures that moved through the ranch in the dark. It was the sound he made when something human approached from a direction it should not be approaching from. She put her eye to the low angle. They came from the east, not the south, the east. 4 of them, moving through the open ground between the eastern fence and the house, with a discipline that was immediately distinguishable from the Boone outfit's approach, distinguishable from the 3 men who had come for the barn. These men moved in a pattern, cover and advance, the rear pair holding position while the front pair moved, and then the front pair holding while the rear moved up, the alternating rhythm of people trained to cross open ground without presenting a continuous target. Not the south, the east. She had been wrong about the approach. She absorbed this without the luxury of dwelling on it, because dwelling on being wrong was a thing that required time she did not have. The east approach meant the ridge position was still correct. She had sightlines to the east side of the house from where she lay, but it also meant that Wick, who was covering the east fence, had either been neutralized or bypassed, without her hearing anything that suggested either. She pressed down into the rock and looked for Wick's position. Could not find it, which meant Wick had moved, or Wick was down, or Wick was so well concealed that even from the ridge she could not locate him. 2 of the 4 men were moving toward the house's east wall, the root cellar entrance, the same angle they had probed in the previous nights, and which had been the weakest point in her defense each time. They had studied it. They knew. The other two stopped at the equipment shed, 60 yards from the house. Not moving. Covering. Waiting for the first pair to establish themselves before the second pair moved. Professional. Genuinely professional. The pattern was clear, and she understood it. And she also understood that understanding it from 200 yards was not the same as being able to stop it from 200 yards, because the two men at the house were now against the house wall itself, in the shadow where the moonlight did not reach, and at this angle she could not put a round into that shadow without risking the house wall itself. She needed them to move. She found the two men at the equipment shed in the sharp sights. They were stationary, covering, their attention on the house, not looking at the ridge. Because looking at the ridge would mean looking into the moonlight, and trained men did not look into light sources. She breathed. Let the breath half out. Let the stillness in her hands find the stillness in the trigger. The sharp spoke. The round hit the shed wall 6 inches from the nearer man's shoulder. Not an attempt to hit him. A precise statement of her position and capability, placed exactly where she meant to place it. Both men at the shed moved instantly. Not away. The professional response to incoming fire was not to retreat, but to find cover and return fire toward the source, and they did exactly that, both dropping and turning toward the ridge, their weapons coming up toward the muzzle flash she had just created, which meant they were no longer watching the house, which meant they were no longer covering their partners. She was already repositioning, moving 10 feet along the ridge to her left to a secondary position she had identified when she first climbed up, because firing from the same position twice was the one thing she knew better than to do. She moved without rising, using her elbows in the ground, the way moving in the dark when people are looking for you requires, which is slowly enough that you do not disturb the air around you and quickly enough that you are not where you were. From the new position, she could see the east side of the house clearly. The two men who had been against the house wall had stopped. Their covering pair had just been shot at from above, and the protocol for that situation, the professional protocol, was to halt and reassess. They were against the house wall, with their backs flat and their weapons up, and their attention now split between the objective in front of them and the ridge above. Split attention was what she needed, because from the east slope of the ridge, below her and to the right, a sound she recognized, doors, moving, not ghost walking, not trying for silence, making exactly enough sound to be heard by someone who knew what they were listening for, and not enough to be located by someone who didn't. A communication. He was in position. He was watching the men at the shed who were watching the ridge. She could not see Dawes. She trusted that Dawes was where the sound said he was, which was the same trust she placed in the dark itself. A kind of faith based on accumulated evidence rather than feeling. She put the sharps on the ground. Took the Winchester. The Winchester was not a 200-yard weapon with the precision she needed, but the distance to the east side of the house from her new position was closer to 150, and at 150, the Winchester could make the statement she needed it to make. She waited. The two men at the house wall had not moved. The two men at the shed were pinned, their attention on the ridge, unable to rejoin their partners without exposing themselves to whatever had fired at them from above. The standoff was using time that neither side had unlimited quantities of, but she had more of it than they did, because she was on the high ground, and they were in the open. Then Reed did something she had not asked him to do, and had not anticipated, and which solved the problem from the direction she had not planned for. The light came on in the upstairs window of the house. Not a lamp, not a candle. The window which Reed had been behind in the dark was suddenly lit from within, and the two men against the east wall who had their backs to it were instantly silhouetted against that light, visible from the ridge as clearly as objects placed on a lit stage. She fired twice, not at them. At the ground directly in front of them, the earth fontaining up from both strikes simultaneously, the rounds landing close enough that the men felt them rather than just heard them. Both men broke from the house wall. Both of them running, the instinctive direction when you are silhouetted and being fired on from above, which is away from the light and toward darkness, which in this case was south, toward the equipment shed and the two men there who were also pinned. All four men were now in the same area of ground, the cover of the equipment shed and the shadow east of it, which was a natural concentration that Dawes had been positioned to address. From the east slope, the sound of Dawes doing what Dawes did, which was move through darkness with the authority of someone for whom darkness was not an obstacle but a medium, was not audible at all. What was audible was the subsequent silence from the four men, which changed in quality, and then the voice she recognized as Dawes, low and carrying ridge. Clear, one word, two words. The vocabulary of a completed task. She stayed on the ridge for another 5 minutes, scanning the approaches, looking for anything that did not belong to the known positions. Nothing moved. The horses below had returned to their nighttime rhythms. The land was doing what it did when human disturbances resolved themselves, returning to its own concerns without ceremony. She came down from the ridge the way she had gone up, using the last of the adrenaline to carry her body through the descent that her muscles would complain about in the morning, and she came around the north end of the barn and into the yard where Dawes had the four men against the equipment shed wall, on their knees, hands behind their heads, in the position of people who have had their situation explained to them with sufficient clarity that no further explanation is required. Wick was with Dawes, not neutralized, not bypassed. He had tracked the four men from the eastern fence line, without engaging, staying with them through the dark, waiting for the moment when engaging would be useful rather than premature, which was exactly what she would have told him to do if she had thought to tell him anything. He had made the right call on his own. She looked at the four men on their knees. Professional gear, good weapons that Dawes had collected and set aside. They were not boys. They were not frightened. They were professionals who had been outworked by the terrain and by the people who lived in it and knew every angle of it, and they were processing this with the particular composure of people who have lost a contract and are now calculating their next position. The lead man was perhaps 40, square-built, with the flat effect of someone for whom situations like this one were professional matters rather than personal ones. He looked at her when she came around the shed, and he did not look at the rifles or the ridge or the dark around him. He looked at her. "You're good," he said. "Not flattery assessment. This is my land," she said. "I've been learning it for 40 years. She went through the lead man's jacket herself, methodically, checking the pockets in the order she checked all things, the order that left nothing skipped. The outer pockets held what she expected: cartridges, a folded piece of paper that was a hand-drawn sketch of the ranch approaches, a small compass. The inner breast pocket held two things: a fold of bills that was his payment and a sealed letter. She broke the seal. The letter was dated 2 days ago, written on First Territorial Bank stationery, the letterhead heavy and formal, the kind of correspondence that was designed to look authoritative. The body of the letter was in Cutter's hand, which she recognized from his previous letters to her, the controlled upright script of a man who had learned to write for an audience. She read it in the lamplight she had brought from the barn. It was an operational letter, specific in the way that operational letters written by careful men are specific, the language just general enough to be deniable while carrying unmistakable instructions. Deliver a resolution to the Calloway matter. Ensure no remaining complications. The property must be available for transfer by the end of the month. Below Cutter's signature, in a different hand, a single line of authorization. Confirmed and funded per standing arrangement. W. Pruitt, Territorial Governor. Wallace Pruitt. His own hand, his own signature, on a letter authorizing what could only be read as an instruction to eliminate the obstacle represented by Nora Calloway and her continued occupation of the ranch. Not deniable. Not general enough. Specific enough that a federal court would not need to work hard to understand what it was. She stood in the lamplight and read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her vest pocket, the side without the letter from James, so that they were not touching each other, because the two documents represented such different things that she did not want them in contact even through cloth. She looked at the lead man. "Who gave you this letter?" "Representative of the principal. In Tucson. Not Cutter directly. I never met the man you're describing." He paused. "Doesn't matter. The letter came from where it came It does matter," she said. "It matters to the federal court that's going to receive this letter tomorrow morning." Something moved in his face. Small. The recalibration of someone who has just understood that the situation contains an element he was not briefed on. "You have a federal connection." Marshal Frank Aldridge, Tucson office. "I've been cooperating with a federal investigation for the past 4 days. She held the letter up so he could see the Pruitt signature. "This letter changes the nature of that investigation considerably. What happens to you tonight depends on whether you want to be a charge in that investigation or a witness in it. You have until morning to decide which is more useful to you." She left Dawes and Wick with the 4 men and went to find Reed. He was downstairs, which was where she expected him. The lamp he had lit in the upstairs window having been brought back down and set on the kitchen table, the table that had been the center of everything. He looked at her when she came in with the look of someone who has been sitting with a significant decision he made, and is waiting to find out whether it was the right one. "The upstairs window," she said. "I know you didn't tell me to." "No. I saw where they were through the gap in the shutters, and I understood what the problem was, and I could solve it without being in the open." He held her gaze with the directness he had inherited from both of them, from James's steadiness and her own refusal to look away from things. "I made the call." She looked at her son, at the 22-year-old man who had been making increasingly good calls over the course of the past several days, and who had just made one that solved the problem she had not been able to solve from the ridge. "Good call," she said. Just that. But she said it fully, without qualification, because he had earned the unqualified version. He exhaled, a small release of something he had been holding. "What did you find on them?" She took the letter out of her vest pocket and laid it on the table between them. He read it. She watched his face as he read it, watched him reach the Pruitt signature, watched the implications arrive. "This is what Aldridge said he needed," Reed said. "Direct chain from Cutter to Pruitt with specific operational instructions." She sat down across from him. Not circumstantial, not inferred. Written on bank stationery with both signatures. "So we go to Tucson, first light." She looked at the letter on the table. "This, plus Porter's statement, plus everything Aldridge has been building. It's enough." Reed looked at her across the table with the expression he had learned recently, the one that was trying to be the face of a grown man and was succeeding more than he knew. "And then it's done." She thought about what done meant specifically. Cutter in federal custody. Pruitt facing a territorial oversight proceeding that Aldridge had already told her would not be gentle. James's name on the record as the first to report this, as a man killed for reporting it. The mine on the Wilson property properly documented and its fraudulent operation dismantled. The copper under the south pasture hers, legally and completely, to do with as she judged right. Done did not mean easy or immediate. Done meant the shape of the future had changed from what Cutter had been planning for it to what she intended. "Then it's done," she said. She went out to the veranda one more time before bed. The night was at its deepest, the hours past midnight when the darkness had fully settled and had stopped transitioning and was simply what it was. The ranch below the veranda held its ground in that darkness. The barn and the paddock and the equipment shed where Dawes and Wick kept watch and the south pasture beyond. And further south the hills where the Wilson mine sat quiet. She took the letter from James out of her vest pocket. She did not open it. She simply held it in her right hand, the envelope warm from being against her for hours, the paper inside it carrying the specific weight of words that had been waiting 2 years, 3 months, and some number of days to reach her. She thought about trust, the specific word he had used, the last word of the letter before his name. Not love, which he had also written, but trust, which was the more precise word, the word that described not a feeling but a choice, a thing you extended towards someone because you had assessed them and found the assessment conclusive. He had trusted her with all of it. He had written that simply and completely and without qualification. She had not let him down. She stood on the veranda of the ranch that was hers in every sense that word could carry, hers by blood and work and 40 years of daily presence. Hers by the willingness to stand on it when standing on it required everything she had, and she held the letter in her hand and let the night exist around her. The horses were quiet. The land was quiet. The 4 men at the equipment shed were quiet in the watchful way of people calculating their options, and Dawes and Wick were quiet in the way of people who had done what they came to do and were at rest in having done it. Tomorrow she would ride to Tucson. She would put the letter on Aldridge's desk with Porter's statement and the bill of lading and everything else the past days had assembled, and she would watch the federal process take what she had built and carry it forward into the rooms where consequence lived. She would testify. She would stand before a room full of people who had been watching to see what Nora Calloway would do with what had happened to her, and she would tell them exactly what had happened, in order, without decoration. But that was tomorrow. Tomorrow was certain, and she would be ready for it. Tonight she stood on her veranda, in the Arizona dark, with her husband's letter in her hand, and the ranch under her feet and the stars overhead conducting their slow indifferent rotation. And she was, For the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and a number of days, she would begin to stop counting, exactly where she needed to be. Aldridge arrived at first light with 2 deputies behind him, the horses breathing hard from a night ride out of Tucson. She was waiting on the porch steps with the letter in her hand, the one bearing Cutter's signature and Pruitt's below it, and she gave it to him before he had fully dismounted, because there was no reason to wait. He read it standing in the yard. Read it twice. His jaw shifted on the second reading, the way it shifted when something confirmed what he had suspected but hoped was wrong. He looked up at her. Pruitt's own hand, he said, on bank stationery, dated 2 days ago. Aldridge folded the letter with the care of someone handling evidence rather than correspondence. He looked at the 4 men Dawes and Wick had secured against the equipment shed wall through the night, still on their knees, still processing what their contract had cost them. The lead man will testify, she said. He understands his options. Aldridge nodded slowly. Combined with Porter's statement and the bill of lading from the mine, this closes the chain. He looked at her, all the way to the governor's office. Then it's time to go to Tucson. He took the 4 men into federal custody with the efficient minimum of conversation she had come to expect from him. The deputies loaded them into the transport wagon, while Dawes and Wick stood aside and watched with the calm of people who had done their part and were content to let the institutional machinery finish what they had started. She shook Dawes's hand and then Wick's and said what needed to be said, which was not much, because what had been done the previous night said the substantial part already. Reed came out of the house as the wagon was being loaded, his flannel shirt untucked from a few hours of broken sleep, and he looked at the scene in the yard and looked at her, and she gave him a single nod that covered everything. He nodded back. That was the entirety of the communication necessary. She put Thunder up herself before the ride to Tucson, the usual morning attention, brush and water, and the few minutes of contact that she gave him every day without variation, because he had earned it, and because the routine itself was a kind of continuity she valued. Then she changed into the clean calico dress she kept for occasions that required it, the dark red one without the mended collar, and she put the leather vest over it and the wide brim hat and the boots. The same boots, always the same boots, and she came out to find Reed already saddled, and Solomon sitting his horse at the gate, as if he had been there for some time, which he probably had. They rode to Tucson 3 abreast, the same arrangement that would hold without discussion. The territorial courthouse in Tucson was a stone building that smelled of paper and recent construction and the particular dry mustiness of an institution that was trying to establish the gravity of age before it had earned it through time. The hearing room was larger than she expected, the kind of room that had been designed for public occasions, with benches along the walls that had been filling since morning with people whose interest in the proceedings ranged from the professionally legal to the frankly curious. She had been in Tucson for years, had traded here, banked here, bought supplies here, attended a funeral and 2 weddings and a territorial fair here. She knew people in the benches. She saw them recognizing her as she came through the door, and she read their faces with the directness she brought to everything, looking for what was actually there, rather than what she expected to find. What she found was more complicated than she would have predicted a week ago. Some of the faces held the guarded neutrality of people who had not decided yet. Some held the particular expression of people who have been waiting for something to break a certain way and are now watching it break. And some, more than she expected, held something she would have called solidarity, if the word had not seemed too large for the small but real thing she was seeing. The hearing convened at 9 o'clock with a federal judge from the circuit court who had ridden down from Prescott for the purpose. A spare man in his 60s who ran the proceedings with the economical authority of someone who had no interest in theater and considerable interest in accuracy. Aldridge presented the evidence first, the bill of lading, Porter's signed statement, the correspondence recovered from Cutter's hired men, the geological survey documentation that had been seized from first a territorial bank under the search warrant Aldridge had executed the morning after the ranch arrest. He presented it, piece by piece, with the measured pace of someone who understands that juries and panels need time to absorb each element before the next one arrives. And the assembled documentation told a story that was complete in the way the best evidence is complete, each piece confirming the others. No element requiring a leap of faith, because the adjacent elements made the leap unnecessary. Cutter's lawyer made objections that the judge considered and overruled with the efficiency of someone who had seen the same objections in different configurations many times and found them no more compelling in this configuration than in the others. Porter testified for 2 hours. He sat in the chair provided and spoke in a voice that was steady throughout, not because he was at peace with what he was saying, but because he had decided that steadiness was the minimum he owed to the proceeding, and to the man whose death he was describing with the specificity the court required. He named names. He provided dates. He described conversations and instructions and compliances with the same careful precision he had brought to 30 years of law enforcement, turned now in the opposite direction, illuminating rather than managing, and the effect in the room was visible, the particular quality of attention that settles over a group of people when they are hearing something that confirms what they suspected but could not have proven. When it was her turn, she walked to the front of the room and stood rather than sitting, because the chair was offered but standing felt more accurate to what she was doing, which was not supplication but testimony, and the distinction mattered. She told it from the beginning. The notebook found under the floor, the wagon tracks on the south fence, the night she had followed the sounds and found the freight transfer on her own land, the bill of lading from the Wilson mine, Porter's account of James's last days, the 3 attacks on the ranch, the letter she had found in the trunk which she produced from her vest pocket and read from directly, the specific passage, not all of it, the passage about James's fear not for himself but for the ranch and for her, his instruction to trust the ground under her feet. She read it in a room that was entirely silent. When she finished reading, she folded the letter and put it back in her pocket and looked at the judge and then at the room. The faces in the benches had shifted in the way faces shift when something has been said that changes the temperature of the air around it. Not drama, not performance. Just the plain accounting of a life interrupted and a land contested and what it costs and what it requires. She said the last part directly, looking at the room rather than the judge, because what she was saying was for the room rather than for the record, or it was for the record, but in the way that things said publicly become part of the record that matters beyond the courthouse, the record that a community keeps in its understanding of itself, and what it permits and what it will not. My husband found something valuable on our land and he was killed for finding it. The men who killed him believed that the value of what was under our ground was more important than the life of the man who stood on top of it. I am here to tell this court and everyone in this room that they were wrong about that. Not because the law says so, though the law does say so, because it is simply, plainly wrong. What is under the ground is the earth's. What a family builds on top of it across 4 generations is theirs. And no amount of money or political connection or hired violence changes that truth. My husband knew that. That is why he rode out to document what he had found and take it to the proper authorities. That is why he did not stop when it became dangerous. He knew that some things are worth the cost of protecting them, and he paid that cost, and I am here because he paid it, and because his paying it deserves an honest accounting. The silence that followed her last word was the kind of silence that has weight and texture, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have a great deal to say and are holding it, while they decide what form the saying should take. The man who stood first was white-haired and had the deep-weathered face of someone who had spent 50 years doing outdoor work in Arizona territory. She did not know his name. He stood and he put his hands together once, twice, a third time, and the sound of it in the silent room was very clear and very definitive. The next person to stand was a woman she recognized from the dry goods store on Congress Street, someone she had exchanged pleasantries with over the counter for a dozen years. And then the person beside her. And then, in a ripple that moved through the benches not in a wave, but in the slower, more deliberate way of people who are making an individual choice rather than following a crowd, most of the room was standing. Not all of it. There were people who stayed seated, people with their own calculations and their own positions, and she noticed them without surprise or judgment, because the world contained people like that, and always had, and what they chose in this moment was their own to carry. But most of the room stood, and the sound of it, the collective acknowledgement of something that had been put into the air and received, was the sound that James had been moving toward when he rode out on a November morning and had not been given the chance to reach. She stood at the front of the room and received it with her hands at her sides, and her hat in her right hand, the felt hat she had been wearing since before dawn, and she did not perform anything, did not arrange her face into anything other than what she felt, which was the compound sensation of grief and resolution, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes when you have held something for a long time and can just begin, to set it down. The judge called order. The hearing continued. The legal process did what it did, which was proceed at its own pace with its own internal logic, and the outcome was not in doubt after the morning's testimony, though the formal determination required the afternoon's additional proceedings and the evening's deliberation. While the deliberation was occurring, she sat on a bench outside the courthouse in the late afternoon sun with Reed on one side and Solomon on the other, which was the same arrangement as the ride-in, which she thought James would have found fitting in the way he found fitting things, with a quiet, private satisfaction that didn't announce itself. "She's going to say yes," Reed said, not connected to anything that had been said before, which meant it was connected to something that had been in his head for a while and had found its moment. She looked at him, at the young man with his father's hands and his grandfather's patience, and his own brand of directness that had been developing quietly for 22 years. "She told you," Nora said. "She told me last week. I've been trying to find the right time to tell you. The right time was last week." "The right time," Reed said, with the patience of someone who has considered this, "was not when you were preparing to arrest a banker in your front yard." She thought about this. It was, in its logic, correct. "Fair," she said. "She wants to live at the ranch. She knows what ranch life is. Her family works cattle east of Wilcox. She's not imagining it. She knows what the mornings are and what the work is." "What's her name?" "Clara." He paused. "Clara Marsh. Her father's Everett Marsh runs the box." She knew the box M. Knew Everett Marsh by reputation. A fair man, careful, not given to pretension. A family that had built what they had with the same unglamorous consistency she respected in her own. "Bring her to the ranch," she said. "When things are settled. Bring her and let her see it properly, and then we'll talk. You'll like her." "I expect I will," she said. "You wouldn't have chosen otherwise." She looked out across the street, across the movement of late afternoon Tucson, the horses and the wagon traffic, and the people going about the business of a territorial town in the full swing of its afternoon. "Your father would have been very interested in meeting her." Reed was quiet for a moment. "Then he would have asked her about horses before he asked her anything else. He asked me about horses before he asked me anything else." "I know. You've told that story. It's a good story," Reed said. "It is a good story." Solomon, who had been sitting with his eyes closed and his face tilted slightly toward the remaining warmth of the afternoon sun, said without opening his eyes, "Your grandfather asked your grandmother about horses before he asked her anything else. It appears to be a family tendency." She laughed. Not the managed, presentable laugh of a woman in a public place, but the real thing, unexpected and brief and entirely genuine. And it startled her slightly because it had been a while since she had heard it in herself. It startled Reed too. She could tell from the way he looked at her, and she saw in his face something opening that had been carefully closed for 2 years, 3 months, and some number of days that neither of them were counting anymore. The court's determination arrived at 7 that evening. She received it standing in the courthouse hallway with Aldridge beside her, the formal language of it confirming what the evidence had established: Harlan Cutter's guilt on all principal charges. The case referred to federal prosecutors for criminal trial. The evidence of Governor Pruitt's involvement transferred to a territorial oversight committee that Aldridge told her, quietly, would not be gentle in its proceedings. She walked out of the Tucson courthouse in the cooling evening air and stood on the steps for a moment before moving to where the horses were tied. The town was doing its evening things around her, the lamps coming on in windows, the last of the day's commerce finishing itself. The smell of someone's supper fire carried on a breeze from the residential streets to the north. She had been in this town for the entirety of her adult life, and she had always felt, underneath the years of commerce and familiarity, the slight displacement of someone who existed at an angle to the place, who came from a land that was not this land, who belonged to a specific ground rather than to a general location. She felt it now. The specific pull of Painted Canyon Ranch, the way it existed in her body as a physical orientation, the way north, south, east, west resolved themselves differently when she was standing on her own soil versus standing anywhere else. She was ready to go home. The ride back was quiet in the way that follows things that have been completed, the quiet of people who have been moving towards something for a long time, and have reached it, and are now in the first moments of the afterward, which is disorienting and restful in equal measure. The horses moved at an easy pace. The evening sky went through its sequence overhead, the gold and amber already deepening toward the colors that preceded dark. Dawes was on the porch when they rode in, and she could treat them with kindness, and she could see from his posture and from the way Wick and Hollis moved in the yard that they had been watching the road, and had been watching it with a particular quality of attention that said they were people who had committed to an outcome and were waiting to learn it. She nodded to Dawes from the saddle. He nodded back. That was the entirety of the communication necessary. She put Thunder up herself, as she always did, brushed him down and checked his water, and gave him the attention he had earned through the day, because horses do not understand the significance of human occasions, and what they understand is care, consistent and given without condition, and she had been giving it consistently for long enough that the consistency itself was a kind of promise she intended to keep indefinitely. When she came out of the barn, Solomon was standing near the paddock fence, looking south toward the hills where the Wilson mine sat in the dark. She came to stand beside him. "It will be in the courts for a while," she said. "The criminal trial, the territorial proceedings on Pruitt. These things take their time." "The land will wait," Solomon said. "Yes." She looked south with him. "I've been thinking about what to do with the copper question. Aldridge says the mineral rights revert to me once the syndicate's fraudulent transaction is unwound. I have options. What are they? I can lease extraction rights on terms that protect the surface land. I can pursue a conservation arrangement that limits what can be taken and how. I can do nothing, which leaves the question for Reed and whoever comes after Reed." She paused. "My father used to say that the land tells you what it wants if you listen to it long enough." "Your father was quoting my father," Solomon said, without any particular edge in it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The night was assembling itself around them in the gradual way of Arizona nights, star by star, the darkness filling in from the edges of the sky inward. "Then your father was right," she said. She went to the ridge before bed. She went in the full dark, without a lamp, which she did not need because she had been walking to this ridge for 30 years, and her feet knew it the way her hands knew the Winchester's mechanism, below the level of thought. The lone oak at the crest was a shape against the stars, the Bia stone below it pale in the dark. She put her hand on the stone. It was cool now, the day's warmth fully given up, the rock returned to its own temperature. She stood and breathed the night air and listened to the ranch below her, the horses and the small sounds of the structures settling and the infinite small sounds of the desert doing what the desert did in the hours when people were mostly absent from it. She did not speak to James. She had spoken to him many times in the 2 years since his death, in the private conversations that a person holds with someone they loved and lost, the conversations that are not delusion, but a form of continuing the relationship in the only register still available to them. But tonight she did not have words for it. Tonight what she felt was too large and too compound for words, was made up of too many things at once. The grief and the completion and the exhaustion and the particular lightness that comes when you have been carrying something for so long that you forget you are carrying it until you are finally able to set it down. She stood with her hand on the stone, and let the night exist around her and let herself exist in it, fully and without arrangement, the way the land existed, which was without apology and without performance, simply and absolutely what it was. 3 months later, Clara Marsh came to Painted Canyon Ranch on a Tuesday in October, when the desert had released its summer heat, and the air had the quality of something restored to its better nature. She arrived on a paint horse she had raised from a foal, and she sat it the way people sit horses they have raised, with the easy unself-consciousness of absolute familiarity. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with the direct gaze of someone who had decided a long time ago not to waste time with indirection. She shook Nora's hand at the gate with a grip that said she worked with her hands and was not embarrassed about it, and she looked at the ranch with the eyes of someone assessing it properly, rather than admiring it generally, taking in the barn, and the paddock and the condition of the fence line, and the way the horses moved in the south paddock, the specific things rather than the general impression. Nora liked her immediately. This was not a surprise, but it was a relief, because she had known it was possible to respect someone her son had chosen without liking them, and she had been quietly uncertain about which this would be. They walked the property together in the afternoon, just the two of them, Reed, having read the situation, and found work on the north fence line that kept him productively out of the way. Clara asked questions that were good questions, the kind that said she was thinking about the ranch as a working system rather than as scenery, about the water sources and the grazing rotation, and the condition of the south pasture, where the copper deposit lay beneath a surface that showed none of its secrets in the grass and the clay and the scattered rock. Nora told her about the copper, told her honestly the full version, what it was worth and what had happened over it and what she had decided, which was to pursue a limited arrangement with a territorial mining concern that would extract a portion of the deposit under terms that protected the surface land, and shared a percentage of the proceeds with the Apache community, whose historic territory bordered the south property line, a term that had required more negotiation than any other part of the arrangement, and that she had refused to drop. Clara listened to all of it. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone thinking rather than composing a response. "Your father-in-law," Clara said finally. "James's father. Did he know about the copper?" No, none of them did. 4 generations on this land and none of them knew. But they stayed anyway. They stayed anyway. Clara looked out over the south pasture, with the expression of someone who is looking at something and seeing more than the immediate surface of it, which was the same expression Nora had used all her life on this land, and which she recognized with a feeling in her chest that she could not have named in the moment, but that she understood later, thinking about it, was something close to relief, that the person coming into her family was someone who looked at the world the way the world deserved to be looked at. "It's a good ranch," Clara said. "Not as a compliment. As an assessment. It is," Nora said. "It's earned everything it is." They came back to the house as the sun was going down, and Reed was already on the porch, having found his way back from the north fence at the hour that coincided with Clara's return to the house, which was not an accident but which she chose not to comment on. She made supper and they ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and the conversation moved easily between ranch matters and other things, and Reed made Clara laugh twice, and Clara made Reed look at her with an expression Nora recognized because she had seen it on James's face in the early years and had forgotten, somewhere in the grief, that she had seen it. After supper she left them on the porch and went upstairs for the first time in weeks, to the bedroom that faced east, to the room she had been sleeping away from since everything began. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window that would show her the eastern sky when the light came back to it. She took the letter from her vest pocket and the notebook, set them both on the bedside table where she could see them. She would tell Reed about the letter properly, tomorrow or the day after, when Clara was gone and it was just the 2 of them and the ranch, the way she had promised herself she would when she first found it and had needed to wait for the right time. She would read him the passage about trust. She thought it might be something he needed to hear about his father, particularly now, particularly as he was moving into the next thing that would require him to trust someone fully. But that was tomorrow. That was the day after. Tonight she sat in the bedroom that faced east and listened to the sounds from the porch below her. Reed's voice and Clara's voice and the particular quality of 2 people talking who have found in each other something they were not sure they would find, and she listened to the ranch around that, the horses and the cooling structures, and the desert night beginning its long, slow business, and she breathed. In the spring, 3 months after Clara moved to Painted Canyon Ranch, with a small trunk of clothing and her paint horse, and the easy assurance of someone who has arrived where they intended, she came to find Nora at the barn on a morning that was cold and clear, the winter having held on past its usual duration as Arizona winters sometimes did, and she stood in the barn doorway while Nora was brushing thunder, and she said, in the direct way she said everything, "I'm going to need to know where the doctor is, not urgently, but soon." Nora set the brush down, turned, looked at Clara's face in the barn doorway, the morning light behind her, the clear, honest expectation in her eyes that this news would be received as what it was, which was good news, which was exactly what it was. She crossed the barn and took her daughter-in-law's hands in both of hers, held them for a moment. Clara's hands were warm and work-calloused and steady, the hands of a woman who had decided what she was doing and was doing it. "The doctor's in Tucson," Nora said. "Aldridge knows him. He's good." She held the hands a moment longer. "James would have been impossible to live with for about a week," she added, "completely insufferable. Proud as anything." Clara laughed, surprised into it. "Reed already is. He comes by it honestly." She squeezed the hands once and released them. "Come in for breakfast. Tell me how you're feeling. Then we'll figure out the practical things." They walked back to the house together in the cold, clear morning, the ranch around them conducting its ordinary business, with the ordinary indifference to human occasion that had always been, to Nora, one of its most profound recommendations. The horses moved in the paddock. The barn stood silver-gray in the early light. The south pasture stretched out toward the hills where the Wilson mine sat quiet now, the limited extraction operation having not yet begun, the copper waiting in the earth with the patience of geological time, patient as only things that have been in the ground for millennia can be patient. And in the earth of the east slope, under the lone oak at the top of the ridge, James Calloway was in the ground of the land he had loved and worked and died to protect, and the land held him the way it held everything, which was without end and without condition, which was the only kind of faithfulness that deserved the name. She stood on the porch for a moment before going inside. Just a moment, long enough to put her hand briefly on the doorframe, the worn, smooth wood of a door she had gone through 10,000 times, the entry to the place that was hers in every sense that mattered, the place she had stood on and refused to leave and fought to keep and kept. The morning opened around her. The desert took the light the way the desert always took it, completely, without reservation, burning it into gold across everything that had no choice but to receive it and be changed by it, and then give it back when the dark came, and have it return again the next morning, and the morning after that, indefinitely, which was the desert's idea of a promise and the land's idea of forever. She went inside. The door swung shut behind her. The ranch held its ground in the morning sun, as it had always held it, as it intended to go on holding it, past her and past Reed and past whatever came after Reed, into the long forward reach of time that the land experienced and the people on it only glimpsed, patient and particular and absolute and entirely, irrevocably theirs.